The island barely stretches 2 miles across, yet for 76 hours it absorbed more artillery, gunfire, and human endurance than some battlefields 10 times its size. In November 1943, American planners studied the Pacific map and circled a tiny coral atoll named Tarawa. It sat in the Gilbert Islands, a stepping stone in a long chain stretching toward Japan itself. Control of Tarawa meant control of an airfield capable of launching bombers carrying payloads measured in thousands of pounds across the Central Pacific. The objective looked simple on paper: seize a narrow strip of land defended by fewer than 5,000 Japanese soldiers. But paper rarely survives contact with coral and concrete. The defenders had spent months fortifying the island. Bunkers built from reinforced concrete several feet thick dotted the beaches. Coastal guns mounted in steel turrets fired shells weighing over 100 pounds toward approaching ships. Machine guns waited inside bunkers connected by trenches carved into the coral. Thousands of mines and obstacles covered the narrow beaches where any invading force would land. Meanwhile, far out at sea, the American invasion fleet assembled. More than 100 ships approached the atoll. Battleships displacing over 30,000 tons, destroyers firing shells weighing dozens of pounds, and landing craft packed with Marines carrying rifles, ammunition, grenades, and packs weighing over 60 pounds. Naval bombardment alone involved thousands of shells fired toward the island in the opening hours, each explosion tearing into bunkers and palm trees alike. Inside a landing craft bouncing across the lagoon, a Marine could feel the metal hull slam against waves as the engine rattled beneath his boots. Salt water sprayed over the ramp door. The rifle in his hands felt heavier with every passing minute. Ahead, the thin line of sand marking the island slowly grew clearer through smoke from naval bombardment. And then the arithmetic of the reef interfered. Tarawa's coral reef sat hundreds of yards from the beach, just beneath the waterline. Many landing craft grounded there unexpectedly when the tide failed to rise as predicted. Marines stepped out into water sometimes waist-deep or chest-deep, carrying rifles above their heads, while bullets from Japanese machine guns snapped across the lagoon. Those final hundreds of yards became a killing ground. Machine gun rounds, weighing only a few grams, still traveled fast enough to tear through flesh instantly. Mortar shells detonated in shallow water, sending fragments through clusters of advancing troops. Some units lost more than half their men before reaching the beach. Casualty rates in certain assault companies climbed above 50% during the first hours alone. Inside one of the amphibious tractors, bulky vehicles designed to crawl over reefs, the engine roared loudly while tracks clattered against coral. The crew pushed forward through incoming fire, carrying Marines toward the narrow strip of sand where bunkers still fired despite hours of bombardment. Once on the beach, the battle compressed into brutal close combat. Japanese defenders inside bunkers waited behind concrete walls several feet thick. Many positions required flamethrowers, demolition charges, or direct hits from tanks carrying guns firing shells weighing roughly 15 pounds. Each bunker cleared sometimes cost several lives. I remember reading after-action reports from Marine units that fought on the island, and one detail keeps appearing: the smell of cordite, coral dust, and burning wood mixing in the humid air. Numbers in the reports describe destroyed bunkers and captured positions, yet between those lines you sense the exhaustion of men fighting yard by yard. American tanks eventually landed on the island as well, their steel hulls weighing over 30 tons grinding across sand and rubble. The vibration of those engines alone carried psychological weight for soldiers fighting on foot nearby. Yet even tanks struggled among the wreckage of palm trees and craters created by bombardment. Night did not bring peace. Japanese defenders launched sudden counterattacks under darkness, sometimes charging across the battlefield with rifles and grenades. Machine guns opened fire again, tracers cutting bright lines through the night air. Flares illuminated sections of the island where fighting erupted suddenly and violently. The scale of the battle remains staggering when measured against the island's size. Within 76 hours, more than 1,000 American Marines had been killed. Thousands more were wounded. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison, roughly 4,000 soldiers, died during the defense. All of this occurred on land barely large enough to walk across in less than an hour. Strategically, Tarawa mattered far beyond its size. The island's airfield allowed American bombers to move deeper into the Pacific campaign. It became one link in a chain of island operations, pushing steadily toward Japan. Yet the cost shocked many observers back home. When photographs and reports from Tarawa reached the United States, they revealed the brutal reality of amphibious warfare. Beaches covered with wrecked landing craft, Marines fighting through trenches only yards apart. The arithmetic of modern war condensed into 76 relentless hours. When I studied the operational planning documents for Tarawa years later, I noticed how carefully every detail had been calculated. Tide levels, bombardment schedules, landing waves. Yet the moment the first landing craft grounded on the reef, those calculations collided with reality. Imagine standing on that beach after the guns finally fall silent. The sand is churned by explosions. Burned bunkers still smoke under the tropical sun. The lagoon water, which once looked calm and blue, now carries fragments of wrecked equipment drifting slowly with the tide. And if you are listening now, as the room grows quiet and the mind begins drifting towards sleep, imagine the island after the battle ends. Waves moving gently across the reef, palm trees swaying in the wind, and the silence settling where artillery once shook the ground. This is the entire history of the Battle of Tarawa, 76 hours of Pacific hell. Chapter 1. The Unsinkable Carrier. What Betio was built to be. The 20th of November, 1943. Somewhere in the Central Pacific, roughly 2,500 kilometers southwest of Hawaii, a coral island sits in the dark. It is not impressive to look at. It is barely visible. Betio, the southwestern tip of the Tarawa Atoll, measures roughly 3 kilometers long and perhaps 800 meters wide at its broadest point. From the air, in the pale light before dawn, it looks like a splinter floating in a flat, indifferent ocean. There is no elevation, no natural cover. The highest point on the island is a concrete structure about 4 meters tall, and even that was built by human hands. The air above the lagoon is warm and close, carrying that particular salt and diesel heaviness that settles over an operational anchorage in the hours before something irreversible begins. Somewhere on the water, thousands of men are awake. Most of them have not slept. A few of them are praying. And the island in the darkness has no idea they are coming. Or perhaps, given what has been built there over the previous 9 months, it is more accurate to say that the island was built precisely for this moment. To understand why the next 76 hours would cost what they did, you have to go back to February of 1943. Not to the beach, not to the water, but to a construction site. Because before Betio was a battlefield, it was a project. Rear Admiral Tomonari Saichiro arrived at Tarawa in early 1943 with a specific assignment: turn this flat, unremarkable coral island into a position that could not be taken by any assault force the Americans could reasonably produce. What followed was 9 months of methodical, expert military engineering. The Japanese Imperial Navy imported approximately 1,200 Korean laborers from the 111th Pioneer Unit, conscripted men, not soldiers, brought to the middle of the Pacific to mix concrete and carry coral fill and drive wooden pilings into the ground. They worked alongside roughly 2,600 Special Naval Landing Force troops, the elite of the Imperial Navy's ground combat arm. Together, over the course of 9 months, they built something that I think deserves to be understood not as a fortified island, but as a specific and deliberate argument about the limits of American amphibious power. It was an argument made in reinforced concrete, in coconut logs, in steel, and in the geometry of interlocking fields of fire. And it was nearly correct. The official post-battle U.S. Engineer Survey cataloged what that argument looked like in material terms. More than 100 pillboxes of reinforced concrete and coconut log construction, each sited with its field of fire overlapping the next at roughly 45-degree angles. 14 coastal defense guns of 80 millimeters or larger caliber, approximately 40 additional artillery pieces of various calibers, close to 500 machine gun positions covering every approach from the reef to the interior. And at the center of it all, a main command bunker whose walls, I've returned to this detail in the survey report more than once because it still stops me, measured 8 feet of reinforced concrete, faced outward with coconut palm logs and packed behind with coral fill. 8 feet. To give that some scale, the frontal armor on a Sherman medium tank was roughly 2 inches of rolled steel. The walls of that command bunker were 48 inches of concrete. The preliminary American naval bombardment, which would eventually expend approximately 3,000 tons of ordnance, did not breach those walls. The bunker is still standing in Betio today, 80-plus years later, between buildings in what is now one of the most densely populated atolls in the Pacific. The argument in concrete has outlasted virtually everything and everyone involved in the battle that tried to refute it. The man who completed the fortification program and assumed command of the garrison in October of 1943 was Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, and he is a figure I find consistently underestimated in the English language literature. He is most often mentioned for a single boast, that it would take 1 million men 100 years to conquer Tarawa. That quote gets deployed as a setup for dramatic irony. The Marines took it in 76 hours, therefore Shibazaki was deluded, therefore hubris, therefore the story writes itself. But when I look at what Shibazaki actually had to work with, the physical dimensions of Betio, the density of the defensive network, the specific mechanical limitations of American amphibious doctrine as it existed in 1943, his assessment looks less like arrogance and more like a professional engineer's confidence in his own calculations. He was wrong, but he wasn't wrong by as much as the outcome suggests. And understanding why requires taking his engineering seriously rather than dismissing it. Here is the technical reality of what Shibazaki had built. The pillbox design at Betio wasn't simply a bunker you shot at until it stopped shooting back. Each emplacement was sited so that its field of fire overlapped with 2 adjacent positions at approximately 45 degrees off-center, meaning that any attacker who drew fire from position A was simultaneously entering the pre-registered killing zone of positions B and C. Destroying one position didn't remove you from the fire of the adjacent ones. This interlocking geometry, standard in Japanese Pacific fortification doctrine by 1943, derived in part from studying British and German defensive systems, had a specific operational implication that naval gunfire, no matter how intense, could not address. Naval gunfire could destroy individual emplacements. It could not destroy the relationship between emplacements. The geometry of death, as I've come to think of it, was not a physical structure that could be reduced by bombardment. It was a spatial arrangement that could only be dismantled by physically occupying the ground. And physically occupying the ground was exactly what the American assault force was about to attempt. Without adequate communications, without an adequate tide, without adequate armor, without adequate doctrine for any of it. The construction program also required approximately 4,500 tons of concrete, mixed, by some accounts, partially with salt water, because fresh water was genuinely scarce on a coral atoll in the Central Pacific. The saltwater mixture was a material compromise, but post-battle analysis suggested it had cured to a hardness roughly comparable to standard concrete, possibly harder in some locations due to the specific mineral content of Pacific coral. Compare that, 4,500 tons of concrete, against the approximately 3,000 tons of naval ordnance expended in the pre-assault bombardment, and you have a ratio that tells you something precise about the nature of the problem. The Americans threw less explosive weight at Betio than had been poured into it during construction. The island absorbed more than it received. The post-battle American Engineer Survey, which cataloged the defensive positions with the flat thoroughness of a parts inventory, determined that the 3-hour preliminary bombardment had destroyed approximately 17 of the 100-plus permanent defensive positions. 17%. Which means that when the first wave of landing vehicle-tracked vehicles crossed the reef at approximately 0910 on the morning of the 20th of November, 83% of the defensive infrastructure of the most heavily fortified island the Marines had yet encountered was still intact and manned. There is one detail in the construction record that I keep returning to, and it is not the concrete or the pillboxes or the coastal guns. It is the Korean laborers. The 111th Pioneer Unit brought approximately 1,247 men to Betio to build the defenses that would kill Americans. They were not soldiers. They were conscripted civilian workers operating under the Japanese military labor mobilization system, a system that was formally voluntary in its initial provisions and functionally coercive in its application, particularly after 1942. They built the coconut log walls. They mixed the concrete. They packed the coral fill. And when the battle came, they were simply there, not part of the garrison, not armed, not assigned to any defensive role, but trapped on an island they had been transported to against their will, now caught between a Japanese garrison fighting to the last man and an American assault force that couldn't distinguish them from combatants in the chaos of a beach landing. Of the 1,247 men of the Pioneer Unit, 129 survived. The rest died on the island they built. When you look at the post-battle American casualty reports, the Korean dead appear as a parenthetical, including construction laborers. In the Japanese records, they don't appear at all. They weren't military personnel, so they weren't tracked by the garrison's administrative system. In neither record are they individuals. They are a number in a footnote, if they appear at all. It strikes me as one of the more consequential silences in the primary source record of the Pacific War. The men who built the fortifications that made Tarawa into Tarawa were from a third country, brought there by force, killed by a battle they had no stake in, and buried in the accounting of a war that wasn't theirs. The concrete they mixed is still there. Their names are not recorded anywhere that has been found. Post-battle American intelligence analysis noted that the D2 situation map prepared by the 2nd Marine Division, completed a full month before the landing, predicted the positions of Japanese defenses along the target beaches with approximately 90% accuracy. The intelligence was good. The maps were right. The planners knew, with reasonable precision, what they were sending men into. And they proceeded. That decision, to assault a position that was accurately assessed as extraordinarily lethal, with an assault doctrine that had never been tested against fortifications of this density, using equipment that had known mechanical limitations and communication systems known to have waterproofing failures, is the founding decision of everything that follows in the next 76 hours. It wasn't made in ignorance. It was made in the full light of available information by competent professionals under real strategic pressure with real operational arguments on its side. Whether those arguments were sufficient is a question the battle answered, at a cost that 1943 America was not yet prepared to absorb. The 20th of November, 1943. Just before 0500 hours, the Japanese garrison on Betio opens fire on the American task force with their coastal defense guns. The 4 8-inch Vickers guns that have been the subject of historical confusion for decades, erroneously identified by Samuel Eliot Morison and repeated in dozens of subsequent histories as weapons captured from the British at Singapore. They weren't. They were sold to the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1905 during the Russo-Japanese War by the Vickers Company, a fact established definitively only in 1977 when British researcher William Barch physically examined the guns on Betio and confirmed their manufacture markings. The Singapore story was more dramatic, more satisfying, more narratively useful than the mundane truth of a legitimate arms transaction 7 decades prior. That's precisely why it persisted for 30 years. The guns fired their opening rounds in the pre-dawn darkness over the lagoon. The battleships returned fire. Somewhere in the chaos of that exchange, an ammunition bunker detonated in a fireball. And on the water, spread across miles of dark ocean, thousands of young men in green fatigues began climbing down cargo nets toward the small boats that would carry them toward a reef they couldn't see yet, toward an island that had been built at enormous human cost, specifically to kill them. Chapter 2. The Cartographer's Gamble. Intelligence, Tides, and the Margin. The 19th of November, 1943, 24 hours before H hour. Somewhere aboard the vessels of Task Force 53, moving through the Central Pacific toward a rendezvous with the Tarawa Atoll, a man named Major F.L.G. Holland is almost certainly not sleeping. Holland is a former colonial administrator, a civilian official who had lived and worked in the Gilbert Islands before the war, and who had been attached to the planning staff specifically because he knew the local geography better than anyone else available to the Allied command. What he knows, specifically, that the planning staff's tidal prediction tables do not capture, is that the reef surrounding Betio is subject to a specific oceanographic phenomenon, an irregular, locally generated dodging tide that can, on certain dates near the lunar neap period, simply fail to rise to its predicted height. The standard tables said there would be 5 feet of water over the reef at H hour. Holland said there might be only 3. The difference between those two figures, 2 feet, roughly the width of a human arm, would determine whether the landing craft carrying thousands of Marines could cross the reef or whether they would ground 500 to 1,000 yards from the beach. Holland had been saying this, in various forms, throughout the planning period. The planning staff had noted it. The operation was proceeding. The tidal question at Tarawa is the kind of problem I find consistently underplayed in the popular accounts, which tend to treat it as a dramatic piece of bad luck. The ocean let the Marines down. Nature was unkind. These things happen in war. When I've gone back through the planning documents, though, what strikes me is that the risk wasn't unknown. It was documented. Holland's warnings appear in summary form in the planning records. The decision to proceed was not made in ignorance of the tidal problem. It was made with an assessment that the risk was manageable, in part because of the decision to use landing vehicles tracked, the LVTs, the amphibious tractors, as the primary assault vehicles for the first 3 waves. The LVTs could cross the reef regardless of tide. They didn't need 5 feet of water. The problem was that there were only 87 of them, enough for approximately 1,500 men in 3 waves. The remaining several thousand assault troops in the follow-on waves would be in conventional landing craft, Higgins boats, which absolutely needed the predicted 5 feet of water to clear the reef. The solution to the tidal risk was always, by the mathematics of the available vehicle inventory, a partial solution. It was a hedge, not a guarantee. The oceanographic mechanism behind Holland's concern wasn't simply a matter of the tide running low on a bad day. The Gilbert Islands sit at a specific latitude and geographic configuration where 2 overlapping tidal cycles, the standard astronomical tide driven by the moon and sun, and a localized current oscillation generated by the particular geometry of the atoll's lagoon entrance, can, on certain dates near the neap period, cancel each other out. The result is what oceanographers would later describe as a tidal stand, a period of 4 to 6 hours during which the water depth over the reef flat remains essentially static rather than rising through its predicted range. Standard tidal prediction tables of the 1940s were calibrated from open ocean measurements and were structurally incapable of modeling this kind of atoll-specific interference pattern. They were excellent tools for what they were designed to measure. They were the wrong tools for Betio. Holland knew this because he had watched the Gilbert Island tides for years. The planning staff had a table. Tables are precise. They are not always right. At 0648 on the morning of the 20th of November, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the amphibious force commander, queried the pilot of a Vought Sikorsky Kingfisher observation floatplane that had been launched to monitor conditions over the reef. The question was direct. Was the reef covered with water? The pilot's answer, transmitted back over the radio net, was a single word: negative. At that moment, the landing vehicles tracked of the first assault wave, 42 LVT-1s and 24 LVT-2s, each carrying approximately 20 Marines, were already committed, crossing the line of departure, beginning their roughly 6,000-yard run to the beach. Nothing could be changed. The neap tide had arrived, as Holland had warned it might, and the reef was sitting at approximately 3 feet of water. Enough for an LVT to cross, not enough for a Higgins boat. Every subsequent Marine who needed to reach Betio that day, and who wasn't in one of the 87 LVTs, would have to wade. Across coral, under fire, for distances of up to 1,000 yards. What I find most telling about this moment, and I've thought about it a great deal, is that the system had no contingency. Not because the planners were incompetent. The absence of a contingency reflects something more structural. The entire logistics of the assault, the timing of the waves, the assignment of troops to vessels, the fire support schedule, the reserve commitment plan, all of it was built around the assumption that the tide would behave as predicted. When it didn't, there was no alternate plan, because building an alternate plan would have required accepting, formally, that the primary plan might fail. That kind of institutional honesty is genuinely difficult in a large military operation under strategic pressure to proceed. The planning process had registered Holland's warning. It had produced a partial mitigation, and then it had moved on, because operations have to move, and at some point the planning ends and the execution begins, regardless of what the tide might do. On the morning of the 20th of November, the tide answered the question the planning process had declined to answer with sufficient force. There is an entry in the historical record from the planning phase, described in Colonel Joseph Alexander's detailed operational history of the Tarawa assault, in which the planning staff aboard the flagship received Holland's title concerns and recorded them as noted. That word, noted. Not addressed, not resolved, not incorporated into contingency planning. Noted. It sits in the record like a small, inert fact. When I first read it, I'll be honest, I felt something close to the frustration of a spectator watching a sequence of events that can't be changed. Holland had the knowledge, the staff had the authority, and the gap between those two things, between knowing and acting on what you know, was filled, ultimately, by the bodies of men wading across a reef in chest-deep water under machine gun fire. The landing vehicle tracked program deserves a word here, because the LVT is the technological response to the tidal risk, and the LVT's own limitations defined the ceiling of what the response could achieve. The LVT-2, formerly the Water Buffalo, had entered production in June of 1942 and had not yet seen combat at the time of Tarawa. Its propulsion system used a grouser track, a metal-cleated band wrapping the vehicle's exterior, that provided both land traction and water propulsion by paddling against the surface. The design was derived from a civilian vehicle, the Roebling Alligator, originally built for swamp rescue work in Florida, and it was functional, but it had not been designed for combat loading. Specifically, it had not been designed for the improvised 3/8-inch boilerplate that Marine engineers in Samoa had bolted around the driver's cab of each LVT-2 in the weeks before the battle, attempting to provide at least some protection from the small arms fire that the assault planners knew would be intense. The boilerplate was a reasonable improvisation. It was also a mechanical problem that the planners seemed not to have fully accounted for. The added weight, combined with the natural deterioration of vehicles that had been at sea for weeks and the strength of a westerly current that nobody had predicted, meant that the LVT-1s leading the first assault wave could not maintain their planned 4.5-knot speed of advance. The vehicles were mechanically defeated by their own protective modifications before the Japanese fired a shot at them. H-hour was postponed twice in the final approach, first to 0845, then to 0900, as it became clear that the LVT columns were running behind schedule. Not all units received both postponements. The carrier aircraft assigned to provide a final strafing run along the beaches arrived at 0855, on time for the original H-hour, and strafed on schedule, depositing their ordnance without reference to where the LVTs actually were in the water. And at 0854, with the assault wave still approximately 4,000 yards from the beach, Admiral Hill ordered the naval gunfire to cease, to avoid the risk of shells landing among troops in open-topped vehicles. General Julian Smith and his Chief of Staff, Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, objected. Hill overruled them. From 0854 to approximately 0925, the assault waves made their final approach without naval gunfire suppression, without effective close air support, and, due to the rapidly deteriorating TBY radio situation, without meaningful communications with their own command structure. 30 minutes. It is a number I find myself returning to repeatedly when I try to understand why D-Day at Betio looked the way it did. The Kingfisher floatplane, the Vought Sikorsky OS-2U, a single-engine observation aircraft launched from the battleships, is worth pausing on, because it illustrates something precise about the intelligence architecture of the operation. It was a two-man aircraft designed for naval gunfire spotting, flying at low altitude over a combat zone, with no real-time photographic capability and no radar. Every piece of ground intelligence that Admiral Hill and General Smith received throughout D-Day passed through the filtered, limited, subjective observations of a pilot leaning out over Betio from a moving aircraft under fire. The most sophisticated amphibious operation the United States had yet attempted in the Pacific was being commanded, in its critical intelligence dimension, by a man in a float plane looking down and describing what he could see. That is not a criticism of the pilots, who were doing extraordinarily difficult and dangerous work. It is a description of the gap between what modern commanders assume they can see and what 1943 technology could actually provide. The tide on the morning of the 20th of November, 1943, sat at approximately 3 feet over the reef flat of Betio. It sat there for hours. It did not rise. The Higgins boats that attempted to deliver the follow-on waves of Marines ground onto the reef 500 to 1,000 yards from the beach, and the men in them climbed over the sides and began to walk. Some were in water up to their chests. Some stumbled into unseen shell craters and went briefly under. All of them were in the open, for distances that took 10, 15, 20 minutes to cover on foot through resistance that the sea itself was providing, even before the Japanese positions added their contribution. The ocean, on that day, did not behave as the table said it would. Major Holland had said it might not. He was right. He was on one of the ships. The men waiting the reef were not. Chapter 3. 87 Machines. The LVT as the instrument of possible survival. There is a photograph in the USMC archival collection that I keep coming back to. It shows an LVT-1, technically the Landing Vehicle Tracked Mark I, emerging from the lagoon water and approaching the shore of Betio. The vehicle number is not legible in most reproductions of the image, but the machine itself is identifiable. A boxy, open-topped rectangle of steel and rubber-tired road wheels, bristling with a forward-mounted 50-caliber machine gun, looking less like a weapon of war than like a piece of agricultural machinery that has gotten wildly out of its intended environment. It was built on a design originally conceived for Florida swamp rescue. It was now being used to assault one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Pacific Ocean. The Marines inside it, if there are any left, are crouched below the gunwale, which is not armor, which is not ballistic plate, which is simply the pressed steel side of the vehicle's cargo compartment. They are trusting their lives to a machine that was invented to pull drowning civilians out of the Everglades. That gap, between the original purpose and the current one, is not the gap of incompetence or improvisation. It is the gap that existed between what American amphibious doctrine needed in November of 1943 and what American industrial production had managed to develop and deliver by that date. The LVT program has a history that most Tarawa accounts skip over because it doesn't fit cleanly into either the heroic narrative or the failure narrative. The LVT-1, the Alligator, first appeared in Marine Corps service in 1941, based on the Roebling design, and was already acknowledged as mechanically inadequate by the time of Tarawa. Its power plant was aging, its suspension was weak, its tracks had a tendency to throw under heavy load. The LVT-2, the Water Buffalo, was the improved version. Stronger suspension with rubber-tired road wheels and torsion springs, a powertrain standardized with the M3A1 Stewart light tank for improved reliability, and new W-shaped treads for better propulsion in water. It entered production in June of 1942. The 50 LVT-2s allocated to the Tarawa assault were, in November of 1943, brand new vehicles encountering combat for the very first time. They were the best available. What best available meant in practice, what it implied about limitations, about vulnerability, about the gap between specification and performance under fire, is what the next few hours would determine. The modification made in Samoa deserves specific attention because it illustrates the kind of field engineering problem that tends to get glossed over in operational histories. In the weeks before the Tarawa assault, Marine engineers at Samoa took the 50 LVT-2s and bolted 3/8-inch boilerplate around the driver's cab area of each vehicle. Boilerplate is the steel used in industrial steam furnace construction. It is strong, and it is heavy, and it provides meaningful protection against rifle-caliber small arms fire at moderate range. What it is not is ballistic armor. It was not designed or tested as such. A Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun, firing the 77mm cartridge, would penetrate it at relatively short range. A 20mm automatic cannon would go through it without difficulty. Against the close-range, direct-fire environment that awaited on the Betio beaches, the boilerplate was better than nothing. Against the 40mm anti-boat guns and the larger caliber weapons that the Japanese had pre-positioned with overlapping fields of fire covering every approach, it was largely ornamental. But it was what there was, and its weight, added to vehicles already loaded with approximately 20 armed Marines and their equipment, degraded the LVT-1's power-to-weight ratio enough to make maintaining the planned 4.5-knot approach speed mechanically impossible against the westerly current the assault encountered that morning. The three assault waves deployed 87 LVTs across three distinct groups: 42 LVT-1s in Wave 1, 24 LVT-2s in Wave 2, and 21 LVT-2s in Wave 3. Each vehicle carried approximately 20 Marines, which means the first three waves put roughly 1,740 men into LVTs, the men who would cross the reef regardless of what the tide did. Behind them, Waves 4 and 5 consisted of Higgins boats carrying the assault battalion commanders and their command elements, and behind those, 14 LCMs, each carrying a Sherman medium tank. 4 additional LCMs carried light tanks. The LCMs were conventional landing craft. They drew too much water to cross the reef. The planners knew this. The plan was that by the time the tanks needed to land, the tide would have risen sufficiently to float the LCMs over the reef. The tide, as has already been noted, had other intentions. The first LVT to reach Betio shore on the morning of the 20th of November 1943 was vehicle number 49, and her name, painted on the side, in the informal tradition that crews often adopted, was My Dolores. She was the right guide vehicle of Wave 1 on Red Beach 1, and her driver was Private First Class Edward Moore. Moore drove My Dolores up to the 5-foot coconut log seawall at the beach's edge at approximately 0910 hours, and attempted to drive the vehicle over it. The seawall was 5 feet tall. The LVT stalled at near vertical angle, its tracks churning against the log face. Japanese machine guns raked the cab. Moore reached for his rifle. The rifle had been shot in half, not in his hands, but where it rested on the vehicle's side, struck by a round that had come through the boilerplate or over the gunwale. Private First Class Gilbert Ferguson, one of the embarked troops aboard My Dolores, described in a post-war account what happened next. A sergeant rose from the troop compartment and shouted for everyone to get out, and at that precise instant, machine gun fire came across the top of the vehicle. The sergeant died mid-sentence. Moore, Ferguson, and the surviving troops went over the side. My Dolores never moved again under her own power. After the battle, Marine maintenance crews retrieved her, patched her well enough for transport, and shipped her back to the United States. She was exhibited in war bond drives. She is now at the Tracked Vehicle Museum at Camp Del Mar, California. The placard, from what I understand, describes her historical role. It does not mention Moore's rifle. The after-action report's LVT status table reads with the flat efficiency of a maintenance ledger, and I found that reading it aloud, just the columns of numbers, is one of the more effective ways to convey what D-Day morning actually cost in mechanical terms. Of the 87 LVTs committed to the assault, 30 were destroyed by enemy fire. 15 more completed their first run and then sank in deep water from the accumulated shell holes in their hulls. They held together long enough to deliver their troops, and then they simply went under. 4 suffered mechanical failures before reaching the beach. That's 49 vehicles lost or mission incapable, leaving 38 operable LVTs by mid-morning, fewer than half the original complement, each of which had been continuously at sea for 5 or 6 hours already, operating at or beyond their designed mechanical limits, trying to serve simultaneously as assault transport, casualty evacuation vehicle, and ammunition resupply craft. The math did not favor any of those missions being performed well simultaneously. There is one account in the primary sources that I find myself unable to set aside when I think about what the LVT assault on Red Beach 1 actually looked like. Corporal John Spillane had been a baseball prospect with the Street, Louis Cardinal's organization before the war, a minor league catcher, which means he had exceptionally good hands and an exceptionally good spatial sense of an object moving toward him. When Japanese soldiers on the far side of the seawall began tossing hand grenades into the open troop compartment of his LVT, which had stalled at the seawall face, its occupants unable to advance and unable to retreat, Spillane caught 2 grenades in midair and threw them back. He caught them bare-handed, out of the air, in the middle of a combat action, and returned them. A 3rd grenade exploded in his hand. He was grievously wounded. This incident appears in multiple independent accounts and in the USMC official history. I mention it not to celebrate the theatrics of courage, but because it illustrates something precise about the physical design of the LVT's open troop compartment. A vehicle designed for transport rather than assault had no overhead protection whatsoever, which meant that anyone above the seawall could deposit ordnance directly into the Marines inside. The design flaw was noted in the after-action report. The armored LVT variants that followed Tarawa addressed it. Spillane's hands provided the proof of concept. The Sherman medium tanks deserve a separate accounting, because their D-Day failure at Betio is a specifically doctrinal failure rather than a mechanical one. Of the 14 Shermans launched in LCMs, all 14 were committed. By nightfall on D-Day, only 2, Colorado and China Gal, were still operational. 4 foundered in underwater shell craters during navigation around the Bird's Beak, the western tip of the island, after their infantry guides were shot down by Japanese marksmen. Each time a guide fell, a volunteer stepped forward. Volunteers kept being shot. The tanks kept moving without adequate guidance and grounding in craters they couldn't see from inside a buttoned-up hull. One Sherman, engaging a Japanese light tank inland from the beach, demolished its opponent, but the dying Japanese vehicle managed to fire one final round at essentially point-blank range, directly down the barrel of the Sherman. That detail appears in the USMC historical monograph, cited as a documented incident. I've always found it somehow representative of the entire D-Day experience at Betio. The defenders, with less equipment and no hope of rescue, consistently managing to be more dangerous than the attacking force's arithmetic suggested they had any right to be. It fascinates me how the official record describes the LVT performance at Tarawa in simultaneously accurate and incomplete terms. The standard assessment, which is technically correct, is that the LVTs performed within General Smith's expectations and delivered more than 1,500 Marines to the north shore of Betio in the first 3 waves, which was considered a successful execution of their assigned mission. All of that is true. What the summary elides is that by approximately 1,000 hours, the surviving LVTs were so few, so fuel-depleted, and so structurally compromised that most Marines assigned to subsequent waves had no transport option other than climbing out of their Higgins boats at the reef edge and walking. walking into a killing zone that the preliminary bombardment had demonstrably failed to suppress, walking across distances of up to 1,000 yards, in chest-deep water in some places, carrying rifles and radios and ammunition above their heads, attempting to present as small a target as possible to weapons that had been precisely calibrated and range-registered for exactly this approach. My Dolores was displayed in war bond drives. Somewhere in 1944, Americans paid money to stand near the vehicle that PFC Moore had driven into the seawall on Betio, and they probably found it meaningful, and their money probably helped finance subsequent operations. The transaction between the machine's symbolic value and the human cost of its first and final combat deployment is one of the more compressed ironies in the physical record of the Pacific War. The vehicle was preserved because it was the first. The man who drove it into the wall, whose rifle was shot in half in its mount, who spent the rest of the battle carrying ammunition to machine gun crews until he was evacuated, appears in the accounts as a name attached to the vehicle. The vehicle has a museum. Edward Moore has a footnote. Chapter 4. Issue in Doubt. The worst radio log in American military history. The 20th of November, 1943. Somewhere between the reef and the beach on Betio's north shore, a sergeant is doing something extraordinary that no one will record. He is crouching over a radio set, specifically a TBY tactical radio, a device about the size of a large suitcase, powered by a hand-crank generator and enclosed in a housing sealed with a cork gasket, and he is shielding it from the salt spray with his own body. He has been doing this since before dawn. During the chaotic pre-dawn cross-deck transfers from the transport ships to the landing craft, during the rough run across the lagoon, during the approach to the beach. During everything that the morning of D-Day at Betio has produced so far, this sergeant has been wrapping himself around a radio set, absorbing the spray and the shock and the near misses so that the gasket stays dry and the circuitry stays functional. His commanding officer, Colonel David Shoup, the regimental commander of Combat Team 2, will later be able to transmit and receive when almost no other American commander on the island can. That functional radio, and the sergeant who protected it, will be the only thread of command continuity on Betio for most of D-Day. The sergeant's name is not recorded in the primary sources that have been declassified and published. He is described in the official history as an enterprising sergeant. That is all. The TBY radio, officially designated the radio set, TBY, operated on VHF frequencies in the 28 to 80 MHz band and was designed for short-range tactical voice communication within a battalion. It was a reasonable piece of equipment for the environment it had been designed for, European ground combat, where radios were generally operated in dry conditions with reasonable time for setup and by operators who could manage the equipment carefully. The TBY's critical structural vulnerability was the junction between the antenna fitting and the main housing, sealed with a cork gasket. In dry land environments, cork gaskets work adequately. In an amphibious assault, where the radio set and its operator routinely go through surf, wade through chest-deep saltwater, and operate in environments of near-constant saltwater spray, cork gaskets absorb water, swell, crack, and allow saltwater intrusion to the internal circuitry within minutes of immersion. This was not a design flaw unknown to the military procurement system. It was a documented limitation. Pre-Tarawa exercise reports from rehearsals at Ifate specifically noted TBY failure rates in water environments. One post-battle after-action report, written by a lieutenant with the controlled, passive voice of military administrative documentation, states with perfect bureaucratic calm that his landing team suffered 100% failures in the TBY radios due to the fact that these sets are not waterproof. 100%. Every radio in the landing team. The seawater got them all. The communications disaster at Tarawa was not a single event. It was a cascade. It began before H-hour, when the flagship USS Maryland, a battleship that had been assigned as Admiral Hill's command ship, fired the opening salvos of its 16-inch main battery in counter-battery engagement against Betio's coastal defense guns. The concussive shock of the Maryland's own main battery, transmitted through the ship's hull, destroyed the ship's internal communications system. From shortly after 0500 hours on D-Day, the flagship from which Admiral Hill and General Smith were commanding the largest American amphibious operation yet attempted in the Pacific, was operating with severely degraded internal communications. The best source of battlefield intelligence available to the two senior commanders throughout most of D-Day was a Kingfisher observation float plane, and whatever they could glean from the fragmentary, partially functional radio reports that came through the damaged communications net. They were operating in an informational fog of their own equipment's making on a flagship that had, in effect, partially silenced itself. The pattern of communications failure on D-Day at Betio, when I map it against the timeline, shows a specific concentration. By approximately 1000 hours, the after-action assessment suggests that roughly 3/4 of the tactical radio sets in the assault force were non-functional due to water damage, enemy fire, or mechanical shock. Battalion commanders couldn't reach their company commanders. Company commanders couldn't reach their platoon leaders. Regimental headquarters couldn't reach most of its battalions. The assault on one of the most heavily defended positions in the Pacific was, by mid-morning on D-Day, being commanded, to the extent it was being commanded at all, by a combination of surviving radio sets, physical runners, and the judgment of individual officers who were making decisions in complete informational isolation. When I cross-reference the communications log against the tactical map, the isolation is striking. Major Ryan on Green Beach had assembled hundreds of men, was calling naval gunfire effectively, and was completely invisible to higher command for approximately 14 hours. Major Shettle's situation on Red Beach 1 was catastrophic. Nobody at regimental headquarters knew the precise condition of either for most of the day. At 09:59 on D-Day morning, a radio message arrived at Shoup's command post. Shoup himself was still working his way toward the beach, waiting from the Reef after his LVT had been disabled, standing waist-deep in water under the pier, surrounded by dead fish and floating debris. The message was from Major Shottle, commanding the landing team on Red Beach 1, and it read, "Receiving heavy fire all along beach, unable to land all, issue in doubt." At 10:07, Chotel transmitted again. "Boats held up on reef of right flank Red 1, troops receiving heavy fire in water." At 10:12, Shoup responded, "Land beach Red 2 and work west." At 10:18, Chotel's final message arrived. "We have nothing left to land." 4 exchanges, 18 minutes. The phrase, "issue in doubt," 4 words, technically a standard military signal phrase indicating that the outcome of the assigned mission is uncertain, is the most precise description of the situation on Betio at 10 o'clock on D-Day morning that the surviving record produces. It is also, in its compactness, one of the most haunting phrases in the radio record of the Pacific War. When I was working through the communications logs against the casualty reports, the detail that struck me most forcefully wasn't the famous "issue in doubt" message. It was the absence of any communication whatsoever from Major Ryan's position on Green Beach for most of D-Day. Ryan had assembled a growing force of stragglers, eventually numbering several hundred men from at least 5 different units, in a relatively protected area on the western tip of Betio. He had a functioning radio. He could reach fire support ships. He was calling naval gunfire onto Japanese positions and having measurable tactical effect. What he could not do, for most of D-Day, was reach Shoup's command post. The reserve battalion that might have been directed to reinforce and exploit Ryan's viable beachhead was instead committed elsewhere, because the command structure didn't know Ryan existed in any coherent sense. The communications failure didn't just prevent coordination, it prevented the information that would have allowed the best tactical opportunity of D-Day to be recognized and exploited. The exchanges between Shoup and Chotel have been reproduced in virtually every account of the battle, and for good reason. They are among the few direct primary source transcripts of D-Day command communications that have survived in accessible form. But there is a context detail that I think most accounts underemphasize. Shoup was not in a command post when he received and transmitted these messages. He was standing in the water under the pier, having been wounded by shell fragments in the leg, having watched his LVT get hit and disabled during its third attempt to reach the beach. The man managing the most critical command net of the battle, directing forces he couldn't see, making resource allocation decisions that would determine whether the assault survived or collapsed, was doing so while standing waist-deep in salt water, surrounded by the physical detritus of the morning's fighting. Wounded, with a radio that worked because a sergeant nobody has identified kept his body between it and the sea. General Julian Smith on the Maryland was attempting to make reserve commitment decisions throughout D-Day on the basis of the most fragmentary, unreliable, and frequently contradictory information set that a division commander has probably ever been asked to work from. At 10:36, he transmitted to 5th Amphibious Corps. Successful landing on beaches Red 2 and 3. Toehold on Red 1. Am committing one landing team from Division Reserve. Still encountering strong resistance throughout. I've read that message many times, and every time I notice the word successful. He is describing a landing in which his flagship has damaged communications, his tactical radio net is 75% non-functional, his best assessment of the beach situation comes from a float plane, one of his landing team commanders is reporting nothing left to land, and the tide has failed to rise. He calls it successful. He is managing the information upward, telling V Amphibious Corps what they need to hear, while simultaneously trying to manage a battle he cannot adequately see. Those are two different jobs. He was doing both at once, in real time, without adequate tools for either. The Kingfisher float plane that served as Hill's and Smith's primary battlefield intelligence platform throughout D-Day was, by any reasonable assessment, wholly inadequate for the function it was being asked to perform. A two-seat observation aircraft, designed for naval gunfire spotting, operating at low altitude over an active combat zone, with a pilot whose entire intelligence contribution was his eyesight and his radio, providing real-time ground assessments to commanders trying to direct a corps-level amphibious assault. The qualitative limitations of this system, no real-time photography, no radar, no secure communication, dependent on individual observation and judgment from a moving aircraft, mean that every intelligence report Hill and Smith received should be understood as what it was: an informed estimate from a very brave man in a very small airplane doing his best. Not confirmed intelligence. A best guess from the air. The decisions that would determine whether thousands of men lived or died were being made on best guesses. The 20th of November, 1943. Sometime after 1000 hours, the radio net on Betio carries an unattributed message. Its source was never conclusively identified, that reads, "Have landed. Unusually heavy opposition. Casualties 70%. Can't hold." It passed through multiple command echelons. It may have been partially accurate about one position and completely inaccurate about the overall situation. Nobody knew. The fog of the TBY failures had produced a battlefield where nobody, at any level of command, had a reliable picture of what was actually happening across the 2 miles of Betio's northern shore. An anonymous signal reporting possible catastrophe circulated through the command net of an operation that had been planned with enormous care and precision, and no one had the communications capability to confirm or refute it with any speed. The sergeant under the pier, holding his body over the radio, was the best the communication system could offer. On that day, it was almost enough. Chapter 5. The Ledger of D-Day. What the numbers actually say. There is a specific 30-minute window on D-Day at Betio that I keep returning to when I try to understand why the assault came so close to failure. Not the whole morning with all its cascading problems. Not the broader failure of pre-assault bombardment or tidal prediction or communications. 30 minutes. From 0854, when Admiral Hill ordered the naval gunfire to cease, with the assault wave still 4,000 yards from the beach, to approximately 0925 when some form of effective suppressive fire and coordination was partially restored. In those 30 minutes, the assault force was in the open water, in slow-moving vehicles with no armor worthy of the name, with no naval gunfire suppression, with carrier aircraft that had expended most of their ordnance on the wrong schedule, with communications that were already fragmenting, and with a tide that was sitting at 3 feet over a reef that needed 5. Every major enabling condition of the assault was either absent or degraded simultaneously in that window. The casualties that resulted weren't uniformly distributed across D-Day. They were concentrated. The after-action mathematics, when mapped against the timeline, show a killing rate in the 0900 to 1000 window that is significantly higher than any comparable period. That concentration is not random. It is the signature of a system failure. The 2nd Marine Division After Action Report's LVT status table is the kind of document that reads like a maintenance ledger and accumulates meaning only if you slow down and parse the columns. Of the 87 LVTs in the initial 3 assault waves, 30 destroyed by enemy fire, 15 sunk from hull damage after completing their first run, 4 suffering mechanical failure before reaching the beach. That is 49 vehicles. 56% of the assault's primary transport eliminated on D-Day. Of the remaining 38, the majority were, by 1000 hours, dealing with some combination of structural damage from near misses, fuel depletion from hours at sea before the assault even began, and competing demands for casualty evacuation that pulled them away from their transport function. But the footnote in that table that I find most revealing is the notation of 4 LVT-1s listed as out of action, mechanical failures before reaching the beach. Not destroyed by enemy fire, not sunk from shell holes, mechanically failed in transit. The battle's mechanical problems began before the first Japanese weapon engaged them. The preliminary bombardment of Betio lasted approximately 3 hours and expended an estimated 3,000 tons of naval ordnance, the heaviest pre-assault naval bombardment of any amphibious operation to that point in the Pacific War. The post-battle assessment, based on engineering surveys and prisoner interrogations, determined that this bombardment had destroyed approximately 17 of the island's 100-plus permanent defensive positions. 17% attrition on primary defensive infrastructure against 3 hours and 3,000 tons of munitions. The mathematical ratio of that result, ordnance expended against defensive positions destroyed, established Tarawa as the primary data point for every subsequent Pacific War debate about how much pre-assault bombardment was actually required before an assault could proceed with acceptable casualty expectations. The answer that Tarawa provided was not comfortable. 3 hours was not enough, not close to enough. The subsequent Marshall Islands operations extended the bombardment to 3 days. The ratio improved correspondingly. Tarawa's 17% was the baseline against which every subsequent pre-assault fire plan was measured. The casualty distribution among the assault battalion's officer corps in the first 2 hours tells a specific story about what the fighting actually looked like at the unit level. Landing Team 22's Company E lost 5 of its 6 officers killed getting ashore. Company F sustained 50% casualties reaching the Seawall. Landing Team 32's Major Chotel reported 17 of his 37 officers as casualties by mid-morning. The Marine Corps Sergeant is the primary small unit tactical leader, the person who physically directs squad-level movement, rallies individuals, and makes the 10-yard decisions that determine whether a fire team advances or stays in place. Post-battle casualty analysis found that 217 Marine Corps sergeants were killed or wounded at Tarawa. A disproportionate number of those casualties occurred in the 0900 to 1000 window, precisely the period corresponding to the approach and initial touchdown following Hill's ceasefire order. When the sergeant layer of an infantry unit is eliminated in the first 90 minutes, the organizational infrastructure of small unit tactical decision-making disappears. What's left are individual Marines making individual choices, which is sometimes enough and sometimes isn't. The 4 Sherman medium tanks that were completely lost before reaching the beach, sunk in LCMs by Japanese artillery fire before the craft even reached the reef, represent a specific form of tactical loss that the after-action accounting tends to minimize. The Sherman was the Marine Corps' primary weapon for reducing concrete fortifications. The plan had 14 of them. By late morning on D-Day, the available armor was 2 tanks. Shoup's radio message to the flagship at 10:45. "Stiff resistance! Need half-tracks! Our tank's no good!" is sometimes quoted as evidence of tactical frustration. But when I look at it against the LCM status reports, it reads as something more precise. A commander informing higher command that his assigned anti-fortification capability has been largely eliminated before it could be employed, and requesting an alternative. The half-tracks he requested, M3 vehicles mounting 75mm guns, the Regimental Weapons Company's primary fire support assets, were already gone. One had been sunk in its LCM by long-range artillery. A second had grounded in the soft coral at the water's edge and couldn't maneuver. The assault force that landed at Betio on D-Day morning had been designed around a combined arms capability that the first 2 hours had largely destroyed. When I went back through the timeline and tried to isolate the specific decisions that produced the 30-minute window of maximum vulnerability, the premature ceasefire kept emerging as the most consequential single factor that was within human control. Admiral Hill's reasoning was not unreasonable. Naval shells falling short among open-topped LVTs 4,000 yards offshore would kill the Marines the guns were supposed to be protecting. The risk of fratricide was real. The risk of proceeding without gunfire suppression in the final approach was also real, and Edson and Smith's objection to the ceasefire was formally documented and formally overruled. What strikes me about this exchange, reading it in the records rather than in the retrospective accounts, is that both positions were professionally defensible. Hill was not wrong that fratricide was a risk. Smith and Edson were not wrong that unprotected approach was a larger risk. 2 competent professionals applied different operational weightings to the same threat equation and arrived at different conclusions, and one of them had the authority to decide. The decision he made produced the 30-minute window. The 30-minute window produced the casualty concentration. That is the chain. There is no villain in it and no fool. There is only the specific cost of a specific judgment made by a specific man under genuine pressure. The first Medal of Honor action at Tarawa came from Staff Sergeant William Bordelon, a combat engineer attached to Landing Team 22. And I think it's worth being precise about what his citation describes, because it illustrates what D-Day on Betio required of individual people at the moment when the organizational structure had largely dissolved. His LVT was hit, and most of its occupants killed before reaching the beach. Bordelon rallied the survivors, reached the shore, and personally destroyed 2 Japanese positions that had been firing on the assault waves. Not with a tank, not with naval gunfire, not with coordinated infantry maneuver, but with demolition charges he prepared himself, on foot, under fire. He was hit by machine gun fire and declined medical assistance. He attacked a 3rd emplacement. He went back into the water to pull out a wounded Marine. He attacked a 4th emplacement. He died. His citation is specific and corroborated by multiple witnesses. The reason his individual action mattered tactically, the reason it needed to happen at all, is that every system designed to perform that function at a scale appropriate to the fortifications of Betio had failed to function. The tanks were gone. The half-tracks were gone. The engineers' formal demolition support was fragmented. One staff sergeant with demolition charges and what can only be described as a complete refusal to accept the situation as it presented itself. That is what D-Day at Betio reduced the assault to in its critical hours. 4 Medals of Honor were awarded to men of the 2nd Marine Division for actions at Tarawa: Bordelon, Shoup, Hawkins, and Bonnyman. 4. In 76 hours, on an island less than 3 kilometers long. That statistical concentration, 4 of the nation's highest military honor in a single small unit engagement, is not simply a record of extraordinary valor, though it is that. It is also the statistical signature of an operation pushed so close to collapse that individual acts of extraordinary commitment repeatedly became the decisive tactical factor. When the systems fail and the organizational structure fragments, the load falls on the people. Tarawa, on D-Day, put more weight on fewer people than almost any comparable engagement of the Pacific War. And the Medals of Honor are, in their blunt numerical accumulation, evidence of exactly how much weight that was. General Smith's reserve commitment decision at 10:18 hours, directing Landing Team 38 under Major Robert Roode to Shoup's command, while beginning preparations to land Landing Team 18 as the division's final reserve, was being made on the basis of information that was fragmentary, delayed, partially fabricated by the fog of communications failure, and completely absent on the crucial question of Ryan's viable position on Green Beach. Smith retained, after committing 3-8, only one landing team as his final reserve. He was doing the arithmetic of an amphibious operation with figures he couldn't fully trust, making irreversible commitments to a battle he couldn't adequately see, from a flagship he couldn't leave. His 10:36 signal to 5th Amphibious Corps called the landing successful. There is a kind of professionalism in that word, under those circumstances, that I find more revealing than any battlefield account. It is the professionalism of a man who understands that the information he projects upward will shape the decisions that come back down, and who is choosing, carefully, what to project. The Vought Sikorsky Kingfisher floatplane had a maximum endurance of approximately 3 hours at cruise speed and carried a crew of 2. By the afternoon of D-Day, the floatplanes were the most reliable source of near real-time intelligence available to Hill and Smith, flying circuits over Betio and reporting what their pilots could observe. What they could observe was fire, smoke, the positions of some identifiable vehicle hulks, and the general outlines of where Marines appeared to be clustered along the northern shore. What they could not observe, from the altitude and speed of a moving aircraft through the smoke of a burning island, was the precise tactical position of any unit, the status of any specific defensive position, or the existence of Ryan's growing beachhead on Green Beach. The decisions that shaped the course of D-Day at Tarawa were made on intelligence that was, at its best, an aerial impression. That is not a criticism, it is simply a description of the gap between what operations require and what 1943 technology could actually provide. The gap was real. Its contents were full of men. Chapter 6. Red Mike Edson and the Argument from the Flagship. Aboard the USS Maryland on the morning of the 20th of November, 1943, 2 professional soldiers are having an argument. One of them is Rear Admiral Harry Hill, the Amphibious Task Force commander, a naval officer of long experience and careful judgment who has just ordered the naval gunfire supporting the assault to cease while the landing vehicles are still 4,000 yards from the beach. The other is Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, already famous for his role at Guadalcanal's Bloody Ridge, and now serving as Chief of Staff to General Julian Smith, a compact, precise, famously difficult man with a red mustache and a professional opinion that the ceasefire will cost lives. Edson's objection is documented. The LVTs are too far out. The defenders will recover. The risk of overhead fire to open-topped vehicles is manageable and preferable to arriving on an unsubdued beach. Hill hears the objection. Hill has the authority. Hill makes the decision. The ceasefire stands. Every Marine who dies in the final approach from that moment forward dies in the gap between those 2 professional judgments. History has no mechanism for adjudicating between them. Both men were applying legitimate operational reasoning. The cost of their disagreement was not shared equally. The command architecture of Operation Galvanic, the overall Gilbert Islands operation, of which the Tarawa assault was the primary component, placed authority over naval gunfire in the hands of the Amphibious Task Force commander, Admiral Hill. General Smith commanded the ground forces, but had no independent authority to direct naval fires during the approach phase. This was not a breakdown in command. It was the command structure operating exactly as designed. because the doctrinal framework for amphibious operations in November of 1943 placed the naval commander in authority over all fires until the ground force was established ashore. The problem was not that the design failed. The problem was that the design created a structural tension between two legitimate operational priorities: the naval commander's obligation to protect his force from fratricide, and the ground commander's obligation to suppress defenses before his troops were exposed to them, and resolve that tension in favor of the naval commander every time. Smith and Edson's objection was formally registered. The record shows it. The record also shows it was overruled. The design was working as intended. Whether the design was right is a different question. Colonel Merritt Edson is a figure who, as I've noted when cross-referencing his role in the official histories, tends to appear in Tarawa accounts primarily as a footnote to his earlier Guadalcanal reputation. This strikes me as historiographically odd, because at Tarawa, he was arguably the most operationally experienced officer in the direct command chain. He had already conducted a Marine raider assault on Macon with limited resources in August of 1942, and had led the defense of Henderson Field's Bloody Ridge against a sustained Japanese night attack that September. His professional assessment of what the premature ceasefire would cost was grounded in more specific experience of contested amphibious operations than almost anyone else on the Maryland that morning. His objection was overruled by a naval officer applying a doctrinal framework. The doctrine, not the individuals, is the structural problem that Tarawa exposed. General Julian Smith's position on the flagship throughout D-Day is one of the stranger command situations I've encountered in the archival record of the Pacific War. And I don't mean strange as a criticism. Smith was commanding a division-level ground assault from a battleship with damaged internal communications through a fragmentary radio net dominated by TBY failures, with his best intelligence coming from a float plane, unable to leave the ship, unable to see the beach. At 10:36, he told 5, Amphibious Corps, the landing was successful. At 10:18, he committed his reserve. At various points throughout D-Day, he was receiving signals that ranged from issue in doubt and casualties 70% can't hold, to fragmentary reports of local progress that couldn't be confirmed or coordinated. He had to make decisions on all of this simultaneously, knowing that each reserve commitment was a finite resource that couldn't be uncommitted, knowing that the information he had was unreliable, knowing that the operation could not pause while he waited for better information because operations on Betio were in real time, and real time doesn't wait. What Smith produced from this process was, by D-Day's end, a tenuous but intact beachhead. That he managed it at all, given what he had to work with, is not a modest achievement. The post-battle debate about Smith's reserve commitment timing, whether committing Landing Team 3-8 to Shoup's command at 10:18 was premature, given that Ryan's uncontacted Green Beach position might have been a better employment, is one of those genuinely unresolvable historiographical arguments that I find more interesting than most of the surface-level tactical debates about Tarawa. The case for premature commitment goes like this. Smith didn't know about Ryan, and an earlier investment of effort in establishing communications with the western end of the beach might have revealed a viable exploitation axis before the reserve was committed. The case against this view is simpler. Smith had no communications with Ryan, couldn't establish communications with Ryan because the TBY net was mostly non-functional, and was meanwhile receiving signals suggesting the entire assault might be collapsing on the beaches he could partially see. Given what he knew at 10:18, committing the reserve to the known fight rather than an unknown opportunity was a defensible judgment. The judgment is only debatable in retrospect, from the position of knowing what Ryan was building on Green Beach while Smith was making the call. Smith didn't have that knowledge. Nobody gave it to him. The communications failed. That's the answer, and it's unsatisfying, which is why the debate continues. The signal sent by Smith to 5th Amphibious Corps at 10:36. Successful landing on beaches Red 2 and 3, toehold on Red 1, has a word in it that I keep reading and rereading. Successful. On the face of it, the landing had succeeded in the minimal technical sense. Marines were ashore, they were holding a strip of beach, and the operation had not been definitively defeated. But the word is doing more work than that. Smith is managing the information flow upward, and what he's managing toward is the preservation of the operation's institutional standing, the signal to 5th Amphibious Corps that the assault is viable and proceeding, not that it is collapsing and may require extraordinary intervention. That is a choice about information management, made consciously by a senior commander in real time. It's the kind of choice that the official records tend to treat as simply descriptive. This is what was reported, when in fact it's prescriptive. This is what was decided to be reported, to whom, at this specific moment. The selection is itself a primary source about how command operates under stress. The narrative of the flagship has one more element that deserves specific attention: the role of Colonel Evans Carlson. Carlson was a lieutenant colonel of considerable reputation. He had led the Marine Raiders' Macon Island raid in August of 1942 and had subsequently gained public fame for his gung-ho doctrine of small unit adaptability and morale. At Tarawa, he was present as an observer, and he was in Shoup's LVT during the 3 attempts to reach the beach before the vehicle was disabled. He was, in the most literal sense, watching the operational doctrine he had spent years advocating being tested against a position that operational doctrine, as it existed in November of 1943, was not quite adequate to handle. What Carlson thought about this is not recorded in any primary source I've been able to locate with confidence. The observer's internal assessment is beyond the reach of the archive. What the archive gives us is Carlson's physical presence in the disabled LVT, in the water, under the pier, alongside Shoup, as a secondary figure in a drama whose primary actors were the people who had to actually make the assault work rather than observe it. He escaped. He survived. The other people in his LVT were not all as fortunate. David Shoup, standing waist-deep under the pier with his wounded leg and his functioning radio, sending and receiving the fragmented signals that constituted D-Day's command record, would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Betio. He would later become Commandant of the Marine Corps. He would later still, in retirement, write a piece for a major American publication in which he argued that the United States had developed an institutional tendency toward military adventurism that constituted a danger to democratic governance. The man who held the line at Betio, under conditions that most command structures would not have survived, spent the final decades of his career warning, in print, against the casual deployment of the instrument he had spent his career mastering. That biographical arc is not a contradiction. It is, I think, a statement of a specific kind, the statement of someone who understood, from the inside, what the instrument cost when it was used, and who believed that understanding came with an obligation to say so. The primary source for that understanding is the reef at Tarawa, the water under the pier, the radio that worked because a sergeant nobody recorded held his body over it. The ceasefire controversy at Tarawa, Hill's decision versus Smith and Edson's objection, was resolved not by the battle, but by the doctrine that followed it. The post-Tarawa revision of Amphibious doctrine formally shifted authority over pre-assault fire support during the final approach to the ground commanders. The naval commander retained overall authority, but the mechanism for managing fire support timing was redesigned to prevent a recurrence of the 30-minute window that the 0854 ceasefire had produced. This reform is documented in the post-battle doctrinal publications and is traceable directly to the argument on the Maryland's Bridge. Hill and Smith and Edson's disagreement is embedded, in its consequences, in every subsequent Pacific amphibious operation, not as history, but as procedure. The argument was never definitively settled by either officer being proved wrong. It was settled by the Marine Corps writing a rule that made the argument less likely to recur and less catastrophically consequential when it did. That is how institutions process irreversible events they cannot undo. They change the procedure and hope the next one is different. The 20th of November, 1943. As D-Day at Betio moved through its darkest hours, the reef full of dead, the LVTs burning, the TBY radios silent, the reserve committed to a battle nobody could fully see. The flagship Maryland continued her work of assembling information, transmitting orders, and managing the institutional narrative of an operation that had gone wrong in almost every technical dimension, while remaining, technically, alive. Somewhere on the water, General Smith continued to receive signals and to make decisions with the tools he had. Somewhere on the pier, Shoop's sergeant held the radio. And somewhere on Green Beach, a major named Ryan, who nobody at higher command had heard from yet, was organizing strangers into a fighting force that would, in the following morning, provide the best tactical opportunity of the entire battle. The information about him existed. The communications system that was supposed to carry it to the people who needed it was sitting at the bottom of the lagoon, or waterlogged on the reef, or simply silent in the wreckage of the morning. And the morning wasn't over. Chapter 7. Behind the Seawall. The Japanese Experience of D-Day. The 20th of November, 1943, 0500 hours. Inside a reinforced concrete bunker whose walls are 8 feet thick and whose interior smells of damp cement and gun oil and the particular closeness of men who have been waiting for a long time, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki knows the Americans have arrived. The garrison opened fire at 0507, before the first American shell fell, because the pre-dawn activity offshore, the engines of hundreds of vessels, the lights, the noise of a task force that had not yet learned to be silent, had announced the assault hours before it began. Shibazaki's position was not one of ignorance. He had expected this. He had spent 9 months building toward exactly this moment, sighting every gun, calculating every angle, mapping every approach across the reef that his defensive plan assumed would be impassable to any conventional landing craft. What he had not fully accounted for, and what the primary sources suggest produced genuine tactical surprise among the garrison, was the sight of the first LVT crossing the reef and continuing toward the beach. The reef was supposed to stop everything. The LVT crossed it without slowing. That moment, the moment when the physical assumption on which the entire defensive geometry rested was visibly contradicted, is described in prisoner interrogation reports as a shock that ran through the Japanese positions before the first vehicle reached the shore. The Japanese experience of D-Day at Betio exists in the primary source record primarily as fragments, prisoner interrogation reports compiled by American intelligence officers, post-war testimony from a small number of Japanese veterans who survived the broader Pacific conflict, and the physical evidence cataloged in post-battle engineer surveys that could reconstruct to some degree what the defenders had done and where they had done it. What survives is incomplete. 17 Japanese soldiers came out of Betio alive, out of approximately 4,836 personnel on the island, and the interrogation reports from those 17 are among the few direct Japanese voices in the entire Tarawa record. I want to be careful about what those reports can tell us. They are filtered through translation, through the specific questions American intelligence officers chose to ask, and through the understandable constraints of men who had just survived something that killed virtually everyone around them. They are not a complete picture. They are 17 fragments in a record that should contain thousands of voices, and doesn't. The preliminary bombardment, experienced from inside the defensive positions, is described in the prisoner interrogation summaries in terms that help explain both its psychological effect and its tactical inadequacy. The accounts describe the bombardment as physically overwhelming, concrete vibrating, sand filling eyes and mouths, men temporarily deafened by the concussion of near misses against the bunker walls, the air inside the positions thick with dust from the pounding. These descriptions are consistent with what the post-battle physical surveys found. The bombardment was highly effective at producing psychological stress and at destroying exposed positions and lighter surface structures. What it was not effective at doing was penetrating the primary concrete bunkers, which, built to the specifications that Shibazaki's engineering program had produced, absorbed the bombardment as designed. More significantly, the accounts suggest that the bombardment's most consequential tactical effect was not the destruction of positions, but the severing of communications between them. Field telephone cables running between positions were cut by the shelling. Messenger routes were blocked or cratered. The carefully designed command network of the garrison, which had been built to coordinate the interlocking fire of positions that individually couldn't see the full battlefield, was partially dismantled even as the positions themselves survived. Shibazaki could defend. What he was losing through the bombardment was his ability to coordinate that defense. The moment when the LVTs crossed the reef is significant enough in the prisoner accounts that I think it warrants dwelling on. The Japanese defensive plan had been designed, in part, around the assault force stopped at the reef would be engaged at maximum range and under the most favorable possible conditions for the defenders. The reef was not simply a physical obstacle, it was a tactical asset, the outermost edge of the defensive perimeter, the place where assault forces would be most compressed, most visible, and most vulnerable. When the LVTs crossed it, the defensive plan didn't fail in any single dramatic moment. It was simply revealed to have a specific gap in the specific scenario where the attacker had a vehicle capable of reef crossing. The prisoner accounts describe what followed as a rapid, disciplined adaptation. The garrison shifted to engage the LVTs at closer range, brought the anti-boat guns to bear, directed the machine gun positions toward the approaches that the LVTs were actually using, rather than the approaches they had been assumed to use. The adaptation was fast. It was also effective. The LVTs arriving at the beach and the Marines climbing out of them entered a fire environment that had been adjusted to account for the reef crossing within minutes of the first vehicle showing that crossing was possible. Shibazaki's death is one of the genuine historical ambiguities of the Battle of Tarawa, and I want to be honest about what the sources do and don't establish. The most widely cited American account holds that he was killed on the evening of D-Day, November the 20th, by a 5-inch naval shell that detonated near his position while he was in the process of relocating his command post, likely because the bombardment had made his primary position untenable or compromised. Some post-war Japanese accounts, however, place his death on the second day of the battle rather than the first. The discrepancy has never been resolved from available documentation. What is not in dispute is that Shibazaki was dead by the morning of the 21st of November, that no senior officer was able to assume effective, unified command of the garrison after his death, and that the defensive Betio, from the morning of D+1 onward, was fought without central coordination, as a collection of individually determined position-by-position stands, rather than as a coherently directed defensive operation. The difference between those two things, a coordinated defense and a decentralized one, is significant. It helps explain both the ferocity of the resistance that continued for 2 more days and the fact that the organized counterattack doctrine the Japanese had successfully employed at other Pacific engagements never materialized at Betio in any effective form. When I was working through the prisoner interrogation summaries against the tactical timeline, I found it striking how consistently the accounts described the garrison's awareness of their own isolation. The Japanese on Betio knew, from early on D-Day, that no relief was coming. The Imperial Navy's ability to project surface or air power to the Gilbert Islands in November of 1943 was effectively zero. The losses at Midway and in the subsequent Solomons campaign had consumed the carrier aviation that might have contested the American task force. Shibazaki's garrison had been built as a self-sufficient fortress precisely because there was no realistic expectation of relief or reinforcement. They were there to make the island as expensive as possible to take, and they knew it. The Gyokusai doctrine, the principle that a garrison should defend to the last man, forcing the attacker to destroy every individual position, was not simply imposed on the Betio garrison from above. It was the only logical response to a tactical situation in which the alternative to fighting to the last was surrendering the island more quickly at less cost to the attacker, which served no strategic purpose at all. The 17 men who survived were the exceptions. The 4,000 plus who didn't were following a doctrine that was, from within the strategic constraints of their situation, entirely rational. The absence of a coordinated Japanese counterattack on D-Day night is one of the most debated aspects of the battle in the operational literature, and I find the debate genuinely unresolvable from available evidence. The standard analysis has two main strands. Either Shibazaki's death removed the command authority needed to organize and execute a night counterattack, or the garrison made a deliberate decision to conserve remaining strength and force the Marines to destroy each position individually, rather than risk losing men in an assault against an alerted perimeter. Both explanations are consistent with the available evidence. Both may be partially true. What the physical record shows is that D-Day night on Betio produced a series of small unit infiltration attempts against the Marine perimeter, probing actions that inflicted casualties and tested the perimeter's integrity, but did not constitute the organized counterattack that Japanese doctrine would have suggested in different circumstances. Whether the absence of the full counterattack reflects a command decision or a command vacuum is a question the surviving prisoner accounts don't cleanly answer. Possibly the men who knew died with the answer. The Korean laborers of the 111th Pioneer Unit occupy a specific position in the Japanese experience of D-Day that the primary sources almost entirely fail to document. They were present on the island. They were not combatants. They had no assigned role in the defensive plan and no weapons. When the assault began, they were simply there. People who had been conscripted and transported to a Pacific island to build military fortifications, now caught inside a battle between two forces, neither of which had any particular obligation to protect them. The prisoner interrogation reports include brief mentions of Korean laborers seeking shelter in positions that the garrison also used, of some being caught in the open during the bombardment, and of some attempting to surrender during the fighting with limited success. The documents are sparse. The detail that most precisely captures the situation is statistical. Of 1,247 Korean men present on Betio at the start of the battle, 129 were alive when it ended. The interrogation reports of those 129 men are not, to my knowledge, widely available in translated form in the English language literature. Their specific accounts of the D-Day experience, what they saw, where they sheltered, how they survived when almost everyone around them didn't, would be among the most important primary sources we don't have full access to. The physical space of Betio on D-Day from the Japanese perspective is worth trying to reconstruct from the structural evidence, because it was a very different space from the one the Marines were experiencing on the northern shore. The defensive positions on the interior of the island, away from the beaches, covering the airfield and the southern shore, were not under direct assault on D-Day. The Marines were pinned at the seawall on the northern beaches, unable to advance inland in force. Which means that for most of D-Day, a significant portion of the Japanese garrison was in position, functional, and waiting, watching the northern shore from the other side of the airfield, or manning southern beach positions that the assault hadn't reached, or holding the eastern third of the island that would take 2 more days of fighting to reach. The island was not uniformly engaged on D-Day. The assault had punched through the reef and established a precarious hold on the northern shore, and the Japanese who were not immediately involved in holding that shore were, in a sense, simply waiting for the fighting to reach them. That waiting, in prepared positions with adequate ammunition on ground they had spent 9 months fortifying, is the context for the 2 days that followed. The Japanese command bunker at Betio, the one with the 8-foot concrete walls that the preliminary bombardment couldn't breach, was found after the battle with demolition charges set but unfired inside it. Someone, in the final hours of the garrison's existence, had prepared charges to destroy the command post rather than let it fall intact to the Americans. The charges didn't fire. Post-battle American engineers entered the bunker and found it essentially undamaged, the unfired demolition setup intact. The person who set those charges, presumably a surviving officer following standard military protocol for destroying command infrastructure, was almost certainly dead or captured by the time the Americans walked in. The bunker itself was not destroyed. It is still standing on Betio today, in the middle of what is now a residential and commercial neighborhood in the Republic of Kiribati, its walls unchanged from the morning they were poured. Shibazaki's engineering, in at least this one physical instance, outlasted everything and everyone who used it, fought it, and tried to demolish it. Chapter 8. Ryan's Orphans, the Accidental Beachhead. The 20th of November, 1943, somewhere on the western tip of Betio, in a sheltered area that does not appear in any operational plan and was not assigned to any unit in the assault order, a Marine major is organizing strangers. Major Michael "Mike" Ryan had commanded Company L of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines when the day began. By mid-morning, he commanded something that had no official designation, a collection of survivors from his own company, men from at least 4 other units who had been driven here by LVTs fleeing the fire on Red Beach 1 and 2, and a growing accumulation of individuals who had waded the reef and ended up, through the geography of survival rather than the geometry of planning, on the western shore rather than the northern one. Ryan hadn't asked for any of them. He didn't know most of their names. He had no orders covering this situation because this situation was not in the orders. What he had was a radio that could reach fire support ships, 2 surviving machine guns, whatever ammunition the arriving stragglers had carried, and the particular kind of authority that comes not from rank but from being the person in the immediate vicinity who seems to know what to do next. He began doing it. The story of Green Beach is the story of what happens when every designed system fails and something unplanned works anyway. Ryan's Company L had sustained 35% casualties wading from the reef, a proportion that would have been considered catastrophic in any other context, and was, at Tarawa on D-Day morning, roughly average. Ryan reached the beach and turned to look back at his men coming in behind him. His own account, recorded in post-war testimony, describes what he saw. All I could see was heads with rifles held over them, men trying to present as small a target as possible to the fire that was tracking them across the shallow water. When he reached the beach and began assembling whoever was there, the tactical picture was almost completely unclear. He could see that the western tip of Betio, the bird's beak, the narrow end of the island's teardrop shape, had somewhat less intense fire than the areas to his east. He could see the seawall. He could see, at some point in the mid-morning, what he described as one lone trooper spotted through the fire and smoke scrambling over a parapet on the beach to the right, an anonymous Marine climbing a Japanese obstacle. And that moving figure became the navigational reference point around which Ryan began to build his position. A single body in motion was the tactical beacon of Green Beach. Ryan's ability to call naval gunfire from his position is one of the more consequential details of D-Day, and it's one that the standard accounts tend to understate because it doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of the day's failures. Ryan's radio could reach the fire support ships offshore directly. It could not reach Shoop's command post, which was a few hundred yards away by water, but separated by the entire width of the Japanese defense. So Ryan spent D-Day afternoon doing something that was simultaneously tactically effective and organizationally invisible, directing naval gunfire onto Japanese positions on the western end of Betio, degrading the defenses in his immediate area. Doing this without authorization and without coordination with any other American command element, and doing it well enough that the western shore was materially quieter by D-Day's end than it would otherwise have been. He was the most effective fire controller of D-Day at Betio. He was also, for most of the day, completely unknown to the higher command that might have reinforced and exploited what he was building. The accumulation of Ryan's force over the course of D-Day has a specific arithmetic that matters for understanding what Green Beach actually was by nightfall. His own Company L survivors were the core, reduced, as noted, by 35% casualties on the wade in. 5 LVTs from Landing Team 1-2, driven off Red Beach 2 by the intensity of fire during Kyle's reserve commitment, arrived on Green Beach and disembarked approximately 113 additional Marines who had no connection to Ryan's unit and had not been directed to his position. They arrived because their vehicles had been pushed west by fire and current and ended up where there was room to beach. Other individuals arrived throughout the day, men who had waded the reef and angled left, men who had been in disabled LVTs and swum to the nearest shore, men who had simply gone wherever the fire was less concentrated and ended up here. By D-Day's end, Ryan had roughly 450 men from at least 5 different units, none of whom he commanded organizationally, all of whom he was commanding practically. He had established a position, called fires, organized a perimeter, and created, from nothing, without orders, without support, the only beachhead on Betio that had genuine offensive potential for D+1. What I find most operationally interesting about the Green Beach situation, and I've gone back to this repeatedly in the after-action analysis, is the specific nature of the communications failure that kept Ryan invisible to higher command. It wasn't that Ryan wasn't transmitting. He was. His radio was functional. The problem was directional. He could talk to ships, and ships could relay to higher naval command, but the Marine tactical net, the chain that connected company commanders to battalion commanders to regimental headquarters to division, was the TBY net, and that net was mostly silent by mid-morning. The communications failure at Tarawa wasn't simply the absence of signal. It was the architectural failure of the specific network that connected the ground forces' internal command chain. Ryan was transmitting into a different network, the Naval Fire Support Net, while the people who needed to know about him were listening on a network that was, for all practical purposes, not functioning. He existed in the space between two communications architectures that weren't designed to talk to each other in that way. The maintenance crews who worked through D-Day night to retrieve and repair Sherman tank Cecilia on Green Beach are among the most invisible people in the Tarawa record. And I want to acknowledge their work specifically, because it was the mechanical precondition for everything Ryan did on D+1. Cecilia had been driven to Green Beach by one of the chaotic sequences of the D-Day afternoon, had grounded or been disabled there, and was non-operational by nightfall. Marine maintenance crews, mechanics working in the dark on an active beach under intermittent fire, with hand tools and whatever parts and materials were available, worked through the night to bring the tank back to operational status. By dawn on D+1, Cecilia was running. One functional Sherman medium tank, repaired by anonymous mechanics overnight on a beach that wasn't in the plan, would prove to be one of the decisive material assets of the battle's turning point. The after-action reports give the mechanics approximately half a sentence. That is the proportion that the official record typically assigns to the maintenance function, which is to say, not enough. The moment when Ryan finally reached Shoup's command and the broader command structure became aware of the Green Beach situation is frustratingly imprecise in the available records. What is clear is that by the morning of D+1, the 21st of November, Ryan's position was known to higher command, and he had received directions to attack westward, clearing the western tip of Betio's tail. He also received, through the informal lateral communication that the battle had produced in the absence of formal channels, access to Colorado and China Gal, the two surviving operational Shermans from the Red Beach landings. The story of how Ryan obtained these tanks involves a conversation between Ryan and Major William K. Jones, the two men apparently knew each other, in which Ryan prevailed on their friendship to borrow Jones's tanks for the Western assault. Two Marine officers sharing tanks on the basis of personal trust in the middle of a battle because the organizational structure that should have allocated resources had either collapsed or was too slow to function in the time available. That informal transaction, Ryan and Jones, friendly borrowing, produced the combined arms force that would clear the western end of Betio on D+1. The planning staff had nothing to do with it. When Ryan's force attacked westward on the morning of D+1 with Cecilia and the borrowed tanks from Jones, the result was the battle's first clean tactical success. Not a grinding, costly assault on prepared positions, but a systematic reduction of the Western Japanese fortifications that moved with a speed and relative efficiency that D-Day's fighting had not approached. The combination of tank fire, infantry suppression, and engineer demolition, the same combination that had been discovered informally on D-Day and was already being transmitted laterally as informal tactical knowledge, worked on the western shore in a way that validated what the surviving officers had worked out overnight. The western end of Betio was secured by afternoon on D+1. The operational geography of the battle had fundamentally changed. The encirclement that would compress the remaining Japanese defense eastward had begun. The term Ryan's Orphans, which survivor accounts and subsequent histories use for the ad hoc force assembled on Green Beach, was not, as far as the available record shows, a term Ryan himself coined. It emerged from the survivors' efforts to explain, after the fact, what the collection of men on Green Beach had actually been. They were orphans, in the organizational sense, separated from their parent units, operating without their assigned chains of command, gathered under an officer who had no formal authority over most of them. The informality of the label is, I think, its own kind of precision. The Marine Corps, as an institution, has formal organizational structures with specific names. What Ryan built on Green Beach didn't have a formal name, because the formal organizational system hadn't planned for it, and had, in the chaos of D-Day, accidentally produced it. The orphans won. The institution subsequently codified what they had done, the mission command principles, the decentralized execution, the lateral resource sharing, and called it doctrine. On Green Beach in November of 1943, it was just necessity. The physical space of Green Beach on D-Day evening, what it looked, sounded, and felt like to be in Ryan's assembled position in the darkness, is reconstructible only from the fragmentary personal accounts that survivors later gave, and those accounts tend toward the selective compression of memory under extreme stress. What the tactical record shows is a perimeter held, ammunition shared and inventoried, naval gunfire contacts maintained, medical care as available. Men from 5 different units, sleeping or trying to sleep in positions they hadn't built and hadn't planned to occupy, under the command of a man most of them had met that day. In the morning, they would attack. In the morning, it would work. In the dark hours between, there was just the holding, the particular, quiet discipline of people who had survived a very bad day and were preparing, as methodically as exhaustion allowed, for what the next one would require. Chapter 9. The Correspondent and the Camera. What Tarawa Did to the American Public. The 20th of November, 1943. Somewhere in the fourth wave of Landing Team 22, waiting from the reef toward Red Beach 2, is a man named Robert Sherrod. He is a correspondent for Time magazine. He has covered the war. He is not new to combat situations, or to danger, or to the bureaucratic negotiation between what a journalist sees and what the military censorship apparatus will permit to be published. What he is not prepared for, what nothing in his previous experience has equipped him for, is the specific physical experience of wading 700 yards toward a beach under machine gun fire. He described it himself, afterward, in terms that I think are worth quoting, precisely because they are the words of a trained observer who understood the value of accurate description and was not prone to exaggeration. No sooner had we hit the water than the Japanese machine guns really opened up on us. It was painfully slow, wading in such deep water, and we had 700 yards to walk slowly into that machine gun fire, looming into larger targets as we rose onto higher ground. I was scared, as I had never been scared before. He survived, he reached the beach, he took notes, and within weeks what he had seen and written would force a confrontation between the American public and the physical reality of what was being done in their name that the United States government had spent 2 years carefully managing and would now find it impossible to continue avoiding. The censorship policy that governed the release of American military casualty imagery before Tarawa had a clear institutional logic. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the Office of War Information and the War Department had maintained an informal but consistently applied prohibition on releasing photographs showing American military dead. The stated reasons were a combination of concerns about family notification — photographs might reach families before official notification, compounding grief with shock — and a broader judgment that images of American casualties would demoralize the public and encourage the isolationist sentiment that the Roosevelt administration had spent years trying to overcome. By mid-1943, however, the OWI director Elmer Davis and, apparently, Roosevelt himself had become concerned that the policy was producing the opposite problem, a public so insulated from the cost of the war that it was insufficiently committed to the sacrifices the war required. The bond drives, the rationing, the industrial mobilization, All of these demanded a public that understood the war as an urgent, costly emergency, rather than a distant military exercise with an eventual good outcome. The photographs from Tarawa, when they arrived, provided the content to test a different approach. Sergeant Norman Hatch, the combat photographer who had stood on the Betio beach behind Major Crow, watching Crow clinch a cigar in his teeth and exhort his men while standing upright under fire, had spent D-Day and its aftermath producing one of the most extensive combat photographic records of any Pacific engagement to that point. He was shooting with a Speed Graphic 4x5 press camera and a Bell & Howell 16mm motion picture camera, protecting his film canisters in the way he later described in oral history accounts. Wrapped in rubber bands, stored inside his jacket against his body heat to prevent saltwater degradation of the emulsion. Hatch was not simply documenting the battle as a journalistic exercise. He was a Marine doing his assigned job, which was to produce a visual record of the assault for both operational and public communication purposes. The footage he shot, Marines moving, positions being reduced, the beach and its aftermath, would eventually form the core of the documentary film With the Marines at Tarawa, which was released in 1945, won an Academy Award for Documentary Short Subject, and was screened at the White House for President Roosevelt, who reportedly said afterward, "I want every American to see this." It contained footage that American civilian audiences had never seen, the physical reality of what a Pacific Island assault looked like at the level of individual human bodies in specific places. The photograph that changed the policy, or rather the set of photographs whose release constituted the policy change, showed American Marines lying dead on the beach at Betio. They were face down in the sand, partially in the water, their bodies in the specific postures of people who had been running and stopped suddenly. The images were stark. They were specific. They didn't look like the carefully managed imagery that had characterized American war photography to that point. The heroic poses, the victorious moments, the anonymous distances that kept the viewer from feeling the weight of individual death. These photographs had weight. Roosevelt personally overruled the War Department's preference for continued suppression and authorized their release. Life magazine published them in late November of 1943, and the American public, which had been shielded for 2 years from this specific kind of evidence, received them. The public response was not simple. And I want to be careful here not to repeat the retrospective narrative that the photographs inspired the nation to greater commitment. The contemporary evidence is more complicated than that. The mail that arrived at the OWI in the weeks following the publication included a significant number of letters expressing something closer to anger. Anger at the military leadership for allowing this to happen. Anger at the pace of the war. Questions about the strategic logic that had led to a battle costing this many lives on an island nobody had heard of. Congressional correspondence shows a brief but measurable spike in questions about Pacific strategy and in demands for accountability for the planning failures that the Tarawa casualty numbers seem to represent. The demoralization versus motivation question, whether seeing the dead inspired sacrifice or demanded justification, was genuinely unresolved in the weeks after publication, and the institutional response to it was not confident. The photographs changed the discourse. They didn't change it in only one direction. Robert Sherrod's book Tarawa, The Story of a Battle, published in early 1944, is the closest thing to a complete civilian eyewitness account that the battle produced, and it has a quality that distinguishes it from most war journalism of the period. Sherrod didn't manage the experience for his readers. He described what he saw and what he felt with the specific, uncomfortable precision of someone who understood that accuracy was a form of respect for the people it described. The sentence from that book that I find most precisely honest, and I keep returning to it because it does something that military histories rarely manage, is this. The capture of Tarawa cost 1,026 lives in 3 days. Whether it was worth it depends on how much the nation is willing to pay for an eventual Japanese defeat. That sentence is a cost-benefit analysis written in the present tense by someone who had waded 700 yards under machine gun fire to reach the place where those lives were spent. It doesn't answer the question. It insists that the reader do the arithmetic themselves. That insistence, The refusal of the comfortable institutional conclusion, the demand that the cost be acknowledged before the benefit is claimed, is why the book remains the most honest single account of the battle that the English language record contains. The documentary, With the Marines at Tarawa, occupies a specific place in the history of American war film that its post-war reputation as the Academy Award winner tends to obscure. It was not primarily a film made for posterity. It was made as an operational communication tool to show the American public what the Pacific War looked like at the level of an actual beach assault, and its content was calibrated to achieve a specific effect: to demonstrate the cost and the commitment that the Pacific Campaign required, in sufficient detail to move the war bond drives and the industrial mobilization, without producing the kind of demoralization that the OWI had spent 2 years managing against. The film shows what it shows, not because someone in 1943 decided to be completely honest about war's physical reality, but because the institutional decision had been made that partial honesty, at this specific moment, served the mobilization's purposes better than continued suppression. That context doesn't diminish the film's value as a primary source. It deepens it. The film is evidence not only of what Betio looked like, but of what the American government decided, at a specific institutional moment, the public could be trusted to see. When Hatch's film was screened at the White House, and Roosevelt said what he said about wanting every American to see it, the political decision embedded in that statement was as consequential as the tactical decisions at Betio had been. Roosevelt was choosing, formally, with full awareness of the consequences, to break the 2-year pattern of managed absence from American public life of the physical reality of military death. He was making a bet that the American public would respond to that reality with increased commitment rather than reduced tolerance for the war's continuation. The bet was, in the short term, broadly correct. The war bond drives that followed the Tarawa coverage were successful. The industrial mobilization continued. The public did not, in any measurable institutional sense, demand that the Pacific Campaign be reduced in scope or pace. What it did demand, in the letters and the congressional correspondence and the public discourse of late 1943, was that the deaths mean something, that the sacrifices be used well, that the planning be adequate to the cost. That specific demand for competence proportionate to commitment was, in a narrow sense, what the after-action reforms following Tarawa attempted to provide. The policy question that Roosevelt resolved in November of 1943, whether to show the American public its military dead, has been relitigated in every subsequent major American military conflict. The prohibition on photographing flag-draped caskets returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, enforced from 2003 to 2009, and then partially lifted, was a direct institutional descendant of the pre-Tarawa suppression policy. The argument that was first consciously decided in late 1943, that managed absence from casualty imagery produces complacency, that unmanaged presence produces demoralization, and that the correct calibration between those two outcomes is a political decision rather than a journalistic one, is still being argued by military public affairs offices, news organizations, and government communication strategists in the present day. Tarawa didn't settle it. It established the terms. Sherrod's sentence, that whether the cost is worth it depends on how much the nation is willing to pay, is still the most precise formulation of the question that remains unanswered. The 20th of November, 1943, moving toward its close. Sherrod is on the beach. The photographs exist and are making their way through the censorship process toward publication. Hatch's film canisters are protected inside his jacket. And on the transports offshore, the first telegrams are being prepared. The ones that will arrive in living rooms across America, typed on thin paper, carrying the kind of information that changes everything that comes after it. The public reckoning with Tarawa didn't happen at the speed of the battle. It happened at the speed of newsprint and post office delivery and the particular stillness of a house when a family reads something that can't be unread. That reckoning is not separate from the military history. It is part of it. The battle and the accounting of the battle are the same event, moving at different speeds toward the same set of questions. Chapter 10. D+1. The machine finds its footing. The 21st of November, 1943. Dawn over Betio. The island is burning in places. Not dramatically, not cinematically, but in the specific, low, persistent way of buildings and equipment that have been on fire through a tropical night and have reached the stage where there's not much left to burn, but are still going anyway. The smell of the previous day's fighting has settled into the air and mixed with the coconut smoke and the salt, and something else that everyone who was there describes in their accounts, but almost no one describes in specific terms, because some things are beyond the vocabulary that writing normally requires. The Marines who have been on the beach overnight, crouched behind the seawall, in the rubble of Japanese positions, in the improvised perimeters that D-Day's chaos had produced, are tired in a way that has moved past ordinary exhaustion into something more fundamental. But they are there. The beachhead held through the night, and somewhere in the pre-dawn activity, a maintenance crew on Green Beach has been working with hand tools on a damaged Sherman medium tank, and by first light, Cecilia is running. The transition between D-Day and D+1 at Betio is the most important tactical moment of the entire battle, and it doesn't look like a turning point from the inside. There was no single decision, no dramatic order, no moment when a commander stood on a map table and directed a formation to advance. What happened between the evening of the 20th and the morning of the 21st was more diffuse than that, and more human. Surviving engineers talked to each other in the dark. Officers who had watched the tanks fail on D-Day worked through, in the specific way that practical men work through mechanical problems, what had gone wrong and what the alternatives were. The discovery that shaped D+1, that demolition charges detonated inside a concrete bunker through its ventilation apertures were dramatically more effective than charges detonated against its exterior surface, was not made by a training manual or a doctrinal publication. It was made by engineers who had tried the exterior approach on D-Day, watched it not work, and concluded, from basic physics and immediate evidence, that the interior of a confined space multiplies blast energy rather than dissipating it. This knowledge was transmitted laterally through the survivor population overnight, not upward through the command chain. By morning, it was in practice on both ends of the island. The technical reality of what inside detonation means for reinforced concrete requires a brief explanation, because the principle drives the entire tactical method that made D+1 functionally different from D-Day. Standard demolition charges, detonated against the exterior of a concrete structure, produce a surface blast that dissipates outward in all directions. A significant portion of the energy goes into the air rather than the concrete. Against 8-foot walls of reinforced concrete, even substantial exterior charges produce cracking and surface damage, but rarely structural failure. A shaped charge detonated inside the same structure, placed through a ventilation aperture, a firing port, or a breached opening, produces a reflected shock wave. The concrete walls, which absorb and scatter exterior blast, instead channel and amplify interior blast. The explosion bounces off the walls and multiplies rather than dissipating. Military demolition engineers have a term for this: confinement multiplication. The principle was not unknown theoretically in 1943. Its application against the specific construction of Betio's bunkers, under fire, by exhausted engineers, with improvised charge placement guided by survivors' accumulated experience of what hadn't worked the day before, was discovered and implemented in the field. This is what doctrinal adaptation looks like before it becomes doctrine. It looks like engineers talking in the dark. Ryan's attack on the western end of Betio on the morning of D+1 demonstrated the new method in its most complete form, and it is worth being precise about what that method consisted of. A Sherman tank, Cecilia, or one of the borrowed vehicles from Jones, would advance to within approximately 50 yards of a target bunker, taking position that gave it a direct fire angle on the structure's face or apertures. Engineers, moving under the cover of the tank's presence and the suppressing fire of accompanying riflemen, would rush forward to the bunker's perimeter and place shaped demolition charges at the ventilation ports. Riflemen were simultaneously engaging the adjacent positions, the ones at 45 degrees off-center that formed the interlocking geometry of the defense, to prevent the flanking positions from bringing fire on the engineers during the placement. When the charges were set and the engineers were clear, detonation. The cycle took approximately 4 minutes when it worked correctly. It produced a destroyed position without the grinding, direct frontal assault that had characterized D-Day's attempts to advance. Ryan's attack moved west on D+1 with a speed and relative efficiency that stood in complete contrast to the previous day's experience, and the western end of Betio was declared secured by the afternoon. The crossing of the Betio airfield, the strategic objective whose capture justified, in the planning documents, the entire operation, occurred on D+1 afternoon, when Marine forces advancing from Red Beach 2 pushed through the interior and reached the southern shore of the island. The airfield itself was, at that moment, tactically secondary. It was a piece of real estate covered in bomb craters and wreckage that would require engineering work before it could serve any aviation function. But the crossing was operationally decisive in a way that the capture of the airstrip itself would not be for weeks. It divided the remaining Japanese defensive force in two, separating an eastern group from the forces still holding the western portion of the island. The Japanese on Betio could no longer reinforce or coordinate between the eastern and western defensive zones. They were fighting two separate, isolated battles, each without knowledge of the other's situation. The compression had begun. The geometry was changing. I've found, when going back through the D+1 records, that the most reliable evidence for what the battle looked like on the second day isn't in the operational reports, but in the medical reports. Specifically, the casualty intake records that show when and where the wounded were being generated. D+1's casualty pattern is different from D-Day's in a specific way. It shows a decline in casualties from approach and water crossing, the primary D-Day kill zone, and an increase in casualties from close-range bunker clearing actions. The mode of killing changed as the tactical situation changed. Men who would have been shot waiting the reef on D-Day were, on D+1, being hit in the specific 2 to 5 meter zone of bunker clearance, the space between when a squad rushes a position and when the position stops shooting. This is not a comfortable distinction. It is a precise one. The battle was becoming less about surviving the approach and more about what happened in those specific meters between the assault team and the objective. Major Jim Crow, the red-mustached, combat shotgun-carrying, cigar-clinching commanding officer of Landing Team 28 on Red Beach 3, was holding the eastern portion of the beachhead against 3 mutually supporting Japanese fortifications that the after-action analysis would later describe as probably the most sophisticated defensive positions on the island. Crow's men had been boxed in by these 3 positions since D-Day morning, unable to advance in any direction that didn't expose them to fire from at least 2 of the 3. The resolution of this tactical problem, which occupied significant portions of D+1 and carried over into D+2, required the specific combination of the new demolition method, tank support, and the coordination of fire against all 3 positions simultaneously, rather than sequentially. Attacking one while the other 2 were free to fire was not viable. The engineering solution required managing all 3 simultaneously, which in turn required a level of tactical coordination that the communications failures of D-Day had made impossible. On D+1, with communications partially restored and the method established, it began to become possible. The Sherman tank Colorado, one of the 2 vehicles operational at the end of D-Day, was employed on D+1 in what the after-action reports describe as the first genuinely effective, coordinated tank infantry action of the battle. The specific detail I find most telling about this moment is not the action itself, but the process that preceded it. Surviving tank crew members had spent D-Day night in conversation with surviving infantry officers, working out a set of informal procedures for what the tank needed from the infantry and what the infantry needed from the tank in order for the combination to function against concrete fortifications. This conversation is not recorded in any primary source I've found. It happened in the dark, between exhausted people, on the basis of what they'd observed going wrong the previous day. The procedures they developed, what military doctrine would eventually formalize as tank infantry engineer coordinated assault, were improvised in one night by the survivors of the previous day's failures. The formal doctrinal publication that codified these procedures came later, written in headquarters by people who had access to the after-action reports. The actual procedure was written in the dark, on a beach, by the people who had watched its absence cost them D-Day. The 1st Battalion, 10th Marines, the division's artillery element, was finally landed on Betio on D+1 and operational by late afternoon. This is worth noting for a specific technical reason that the standard accounts generally pass over. The dimensions of Betio, roughly 3 kilometers long and 800 meters wide at its broadest, meant that the distance from the artillery's firing positions to the farthest Japanese positions was approximately 2,600 yards at most. For a 75mm howitzer, that is within direct fire range. The Marines' own artillery was, in the specific geometry of Betio, sometimes more useful in direct fire mode than in the indirect fire configuration it was designed for. Tarawa was the only major Pacific campaign where field artillery could engage targets by direct observation and direct aim, rather than through the standard process of plotting and adjusting in direct fire. The island was so small that the howitzers could see what they were shooting at. That operational specificity, artillery used as an oversized direct fire weapon, is a detail that the standard descriptions of artillery support tend to elide, and it mattered for the character of the D+1 and D+2 fighting. The evening of D+1. Ryan's western beachhead is secured. The airfield has been crossed. Crow's eastern position is still contested, but no longer deteriorating. The communications net, while far from fully functional, has improved enough to give General Smith a more coherent picture of the battlefield than he had at any point on D-Day. On the flagship Maryland, the damage from the opening salvos of 19 hours ago is partially repaired. The Kingfisher float planes are still flying circuits, and somewhere in the eastern third of Betio, the surviving elements of Shibazaki's garrison, compressed into an area they can no longer reinforce or resupply, under a command structure that died with their admiral, are occupying their prepared positions and waiting for the 3rd day of a battle that, from inside those positions, can have only one ending. The island that was built to be unsinkable is, by nightfall on D+1, sinking slowly, position by position, under a method that wasn't in the plan when the assault began. Chapter 11. The Sergeant's Letters, a microchapter on 3 human days. The 20th of November, 1943, the 5th day before Thanksgiving. In the continental United States, grocery stores are navigating rationing allocations. In the Gilbert Islands, roughly 2,500 kilometers southwest of Hawaii, a Marine private first class is behind a 5-foot coconut log seawall on an island he has never heard of before this week, and he cannot move. He cannot move because the space between his current position and the next piece of cover is, in his own description, recorded in a letter written after the battle and later quoted in a post-war oral history collection, about the size of our living room, and it was all someone needed. Not all the enemy needed to kill us, not a fatal killing ground, not the measured language of operational analysis. The size of a living room. He is measuring the distance between life and death in the dimensions of the house where he grew up, because that is the only reference scale he brought with him. And the house is the most precise unit of measurement he has for the specific interior experience of what it felt like to be unable to move across 20 feet of open ground in the middle of an assault on a Pacific atoll. I don't know his name. The oral history collection doesn't record it. He survived. He wrote the letter. The living room measured the same. The individual experience of Betio across 76 hours is the least documented and most important dimension of the battle, and there is a specific reason it's underdocumented that I want to name directly. The primary source machinery of military history is designed to capture institutional decisions, unit actions, and tactical outcomes, and it captures those things with considerable precision. It is not designed to capture what it felt like to be behind a seawall for 4 hours, or to carry ammunition across 30 meters of fire-exposed ground, or to lie in the dark for a night that lasted considerably longer than any previous night in your experience. The diaries and letters that capture those experiences were mostly written after the fact, are held in private collections, or accessible only through intermediary oral history projects, and are systematically underrepresented in the official archives. What we have are fragments. The living room. Sergeant Johnson's single-sentence description of a wounded captain sending a message apologizing for letting you down. The anonymous sergeant asking Ryan where he was needed most, on a leg that was already wounded. The fragments don't add up to a complete picture. They add up to a kind of insistence that the complete picture exists and always did, even when the archive couldn't hold it. The experience of D-Day night on Betio has a quality in the survivor accounts that is different from the daytime fighting, and the difference is specific. The daytime had direction. There was an objective, a movement, a thing you were supposed to be doing or trying to do. The night had none of these. The night had sounds, the specific, unidentifiable sounds of a tropical island with a Japanese garrison in it, where any movement could be the approach of an infiltration attempt, and any noise could be the precursor to fire. And the experience of lying absolutely still in the dark and trying to read those sounds without moving, without light, without the kind of sensory information that humans normally use to assess threat. The Marines on Betio had been awake for between 20 and 24 hours by nightfall on D-Day. They had waded reefs, fought through beach obstacles, been in and out of salt water multiple times, and were now expected to maintain perimeter vigilance through a tropical night. The after-action reports note intermittent enemy infiltration attempts throughout D-Day night. The survivor accounts describe the experience of those attempts somewhat differently, as a sustained, low-grade terror that had a different texture from the concentrated, acute fear of the assault. And that was, in some respects, harder to manage because there was nothing to do about it except stay awake and stay still. The water supply failure at Betio is one of the sustainment details that the post-battle operational analysis treated briefly, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives. Marines who had been in or near saltwater for between 6 and 8 hours on D-Day morning, and who had been fighting continuously since approximately 0900, had no access to fresh water for the remainder of D-Day and into the night. The logistics of freshwater delivery, across a reef covered with wreckage and still under intermittent fire, with no functional landing craft, and with the surviving LVTs committed to assault and casualty evacuation, was simply not achievable on D-Day. The medical records from the Tarawa operation, cross-referenced with the after-action casualty reports, show a measurable number of heat exhaustion and dehydration cases that don't appear in the combat casualty count. Men who were medically compromised not by enemy fire, but by the combination of tropical heat, salt water exposure, and 18-plus hours without fresh water while performing maximum physical exertion. This casualty category is invisible in the standard numbers. It exists in the medical logs. Medical evacuation at Tarawa on D-Day was, functionally, not a system. It was a collection of individual improvised efforts in the absence of any operational evacuation infrastructure. Wounded Marines lay on the beach, in the water, under the seawall, in the rubble of destroyed LVTs, for periods ranging from hours to the entirety of D-Day before evacuation became possible. The transport ships with their surgical facilities were miles offshore, separated from the beachhead by the same reef that had stopped the Higgins boats, meaning that getting a wounded man from the beach to surgery required an LVT, of which there were 38 operational by mid-morning, each of which was simultaneously needed for assault transport, ammunition resupply, and now casualty evacuation. The after-action medical reports identified the treatment to evacuation lag as one of the primary causes of preventable deaths at Tarawa. Wounds that were survivable with prompt surgical intervention became fatal wounds given the delays that the logistics imposed. This is not in the combat casualty figures. It is in the medical figures. The two figures measure different things, and both are necessary to understand what the battle actually cost at the individual human level. The physical space of the seawall, the 5-foot coconut log barrier that ran along the top of the beach, is one of those specific features of Betio that I find most difficult to convey in the abstract. It was both the Marines' primary shelter and the primary obstacle to their advance. Behind it, you were below the trajectory of most of the fire coming from the interior. In front of it, you were exposed to everything on the other side. The decision of whether and when to go over the top, to expose yourself completely for the period of climbing and landing on the other side, was made by individual Marines, generally without officers, generally on the basis of what the person next to them seemed to be doing, generally in a state of exhaustion and stress that would have impaired any normal decision-making process significantly. The seawall produced a specific spatial psychology that the survivor accounts returned to repeatedly. The compulsion to keep as much of the body below the top as possible, to read the fire above by sound rather than sight, to wait for a moment when the fire seems slightly less concentrated before committing to the crossing. Some men waited for hours. Some never got over it on D-Day. Some went over and were immediately hit. Some went over and were not. The seawall didn't sort those outcomes by any principle that survivors could reliably identify. 217 Marine Corps sergeants were killed or wounded at Tarawa. That figure, drawn from post-battle casualty analysis, sits in the operational record as a number, and I want to spend a moment on what it represents structurally. The sergeant is the primary small unit tactical leader, the person who physically moves a squad, who makes the 10-meter decisions, who sustains the momentum of an assault or maintains the discipline of a defensive position. When a battalion loses its lieutenant colonel, the major takes command, and the major has been trained for that transition. When a company loses its captain, the senior lieutenant steps up. When a squad loses its sergeant, there is no designated replacement. There is just whoever is left, doing what they can, without the rank that conveys authority or the specific training for small unit leadership. 217 sergeants in 76 hours on an island less than 3 kilometers long. The post-battle casualty analysis shows that a disproportionate number of those losses occurred in the first 90 minutes of D-Day, the period when the assault was most exposed and the fighting was at its most concentrated. The organizational infrastructure of small unit Marine infantry was systematically degraded in the first 90 minutes of the battle. Everything that followed, the improvisations, the ad hoc formations, the informal lateral transmissions of tactical knowledge, happened in the space that 217 sergeants had previously occupied. The experience of D+2, the final day of organized fighting, is described in the survivor accounts with a quality that I can only call exhausted precision. Men who had been fighting, sleeping in the open, going without fresh water, and carrying the accumulated physical and psychological load of 2 days at Betio were conducting, on the third day, a systematic and methodical clearance of the remaining Japanese positions. The after-action reports described the D+2 operations as effective and methodical. They were. They were also being performed by people who had reached a state of depletion that is difficult to describe without recourse to the specific language that the survivor accounts use, which tends toward functional description rather than emotional characterization. You kept moving because stopping didn't make the situation better. You cleared the next position because the one after that was the last one between you and the thing being over. The methodology was good. The people applying it were at the absolute limit of what human endurance can sustain over 3 days of continuous stress and combat. The 23rd of November, 1943. The Battle of Betio is declared secured at approximately 1300 hours. The official time appears in the after-action report alongside the administrative machinery of a concluded operation: unit positions, casualty counts, equipment status, prisoner numbers. The men who have been there for 76 hours don't experience the securing as a moment of transformation. They experience it as the cessation of one specific kind of pressure, the most immediate, physical kind, and the beginning of a different kind. The silence that follows combat, the attempt to reconstruct what has happened, the awareness of who is no longer there. Some accounts describe men simply sitting down. Others describe a kind of mechanical continuation of the clearance activity that had been their entire existence for 3 days. Men still checking positions, still moving by the habits that the previous 76 hours had carved into their behavior, moving through an island that was no longer shooting back. The living room was no longer the measure of the distance. The island was secured. The men who had measured it in those terms were doing whatever you do with a body that has been in maximum stress for 72 hours when the stress suddenly stops and the accounting begins. Chapter 12. D+2. The Island Dies. The 22nd of November, 1943. The eastern third of Betio. Compressed into roughly a third of the island's total area, perhaps 90 to 100 acres, an area smaller than many urban parks, the surviving elements of Shibazaki's garrison are occupying prepared positions that they have held, individually and collectively, for 2 days. They have no supplies coming in. They have no communications with anyone outside Betio. They have no expectation of relief. What they have is the specific architecture of interlocking defensive positions that Shibazaki's engineering program spent 9 months building, each position still mostly intact, each still capable of generating the overlapping fields of fire that the entire defensive geometry was designed to produce. The Marines attacking from the west have cleared the airfield. Ryan has secured the tail. The geometry is compressing. The remaining Japanese force is being pushed into a smaller and smaller volume of ground, against a perimeter that is tightening from 3 directions simultaneously. They know this. The arithmetic of their situation is not subtle. Major William K. Willie K. Jones was the commanding officer attacking the eastern positions on D+2, and the specific detail of how he obtained his armor is the one I keep returning to when I try to understand the informal command economy that Tarawa had produced by its 3rd day. Jones needed tanks for his assault on the eastern fortifications. He had none assigned to his force. Ryan, on the western end, had the 2 surviving Shermans, Colorado and China Gal, which had cleared the western positions the previous day and were now available for redeployment. Jones and Ryan were acquainted. Jones, as the official history puts it, prevailed on their friendship to borrow the 2 tanks. This informal transaction, a major asking a fellow major for equipment that wasn't his to give, based on personal trust, in the middle of an active battle, produced the armored component of the D+2 assault on the eastern fortifications. The organizational resource allocation system that should have managed tank deployment to assault units had either not functioned fast enough or had not addressed this specific need. The friendship filled the gap. The Shermans cleared the eastern positions. The friendship between 2 officers is embedded in the battle's final tactical success in a way that no formal order or doctrinal publication can account for. The tank infantry engineer method on D+2 was, by the standards of D-Day, almost recognizable as a coordinated combined arms operation. Tank advances to 50 yards. Engineers rush forward under tank cover and suppressing infantry fire. Charges placed at ventilation apertures and firing ports. Adjacent positions suppressed simultaneously. Detonation. 4 minutes per position, roughly, when the execution was clean. What made it possible on D+2 that had been impossible on D-Day was not primarily the availability of tanks. There had been tanks on D-Day before most of them were destroyed. It was the doctrine. Not the formal doctrine, which didn't exist yet. The informal doctrine. The procedure that engineers and infantry officers had worked out in conversations during the D-Day night, transmitted laterally across the assault force through the particular communications network that running combat had organically produced. The one where you tell the next group over what you'd learned because the alternative was watching them make the same mistakes you'd already paid for. That network worked when the TBY radios didn't. It carried knowledge in the way that informal human systems carry knowledge. Imperfectly, selectively, but persistently, because the people doing the carrying understood that the knowledge mattered. The 3 mutually supporting Japanese fortifications that had held Crow's Landing Team 2-8 boxed in since D-Day morning, Three positions configured so that attacking any one of them brought you into the direct fire of the other two, were the primary tactical problem of D+2 on the eastern end of the island. The solution was geometrically simple and tactically demanding. Suppress all three simultaneously, rather than attacking sequentially. This required coordinating fire from multiple sources against multiple positions in a timing sequence tight enough that none of the three could shift to concentrate fire on the assault element at any point during the approach. It required the artillery that had become operational on D+1, the two Shermans borrowed from Ryan, suppressing infantry on multiple axes, and engineers ready to move on each position the instant its fire was suppressed. When it worked, and on D+2 the accounts suggest it worked, the three positions came down in a sequence that the surviving accounts describe as faster than anything attempted in the previous 2 days. The method was right. The method had been invented on a beach during a night that had no witnesses worth recording. The final hours of organized Japanese resistance at Betio are documented in a way that reflects the asymmetry of who was doing the documenting. American accounts are relatively detailed. Positions cleared, times recorded, unit dispositions noted. The Japanese experience of those hours exists primarily in the physical evidence. The state of the positions when American forces entered them, the distribution of the dead, the unfired demolition charges in the command bunker, and in the fragmentary testimony of the 17 men who survived. What those accounts convey is a garrison that fought not from any realistic expectation of survival, but from the operational logic of the Gyokusai doctrine, that a defending force facing inevitable defeat maximizes its strategic value by making the attacker destroy every individual position rather than accepting a collective capitulation. The doctrine was rational. It was also, in the specific context of Betio, remarkably effective by its own measure. It took the Marines 76 hours and approximately 3,000 total casualties to clear 291 acres. The ratio of American cost to Japanese ground surrendered is, by the arithmetic of attritional warfare, extraordinarily unfavorable to the attacker. The banzai charge that ended organized resistance at Betio came shortly after midnight on the night of D+2, technically in the early hours of the 23rd of November, 1943. The remaining organized Japanese force, estimated at between 300 and 500 men under whatever officer commanded what was left of the garrison structure, launched a mass assault against the Marine perimeter around the eastern positions. The Marines were prepared. They had spent 2 days learning the specific patterns of Japanese night operations at Betio, and the perimeter had been set accordingly. Machine guns pre-positioned, 37mm guns loaded with canister, riflemen awake and oriented. The charge was met with concentrated fire from weapons that had been specifically prepared to receive it, and by dawn, the ground in front of the Marine perimeter held the evidence of what concentrated fire against a massed assault in the open does. Organized resistance on Betio was over. I want to be careful about how I characterize the banzai charge, because the popular historiography of Pacific War combat has consistently rendered these final assaults as evidence of fanaticism, irrational, suicidal acts by men in the grip of an ideology that valued death over surrender. The operational analysis of the Betio charge doesn't entirely support this framing. By the night of D+2, the surviving Japanese force on the eastern third of the island had no supplies, no communications, no command structure above the immediate survivor pool, no possibility of reinforcement or extraction, and the certain knowledge that the compressed area they occupied would be cleared within hours, regardless of what they did. Given those conditions, the charge represents something closer to a rational calculation than a loss of rationality. Remaining in place means death in collapsing positions sometime in the next 12 hours. Attacking means the possibility, however remote, of breaking through the perimeter, achieving tactical disruption, and dying in a way that serves the defensive mission's final purpose. The mathematics are grim. They are not irrational. Of the 4,836 personnel on Betio when the battle began, military and civilian, Japanese and Korean, 17 Japanese soldiers were taken alive. 129 Korean laborers survived to surrender. Everyone else was dead. The ratio of Japanese military dead to prisoners, approximately 276 to 1, is one of the highest in any engagement of the Pacific War. American officers walking through the defensive positions in the hours after the battle's end described the experience in terms that don't translate easily into operational language, because operational language is designed for the living, and what they encountered was a specific, concentrated, total silence that the previous 76 hours had not contained. Some accounts describe a methodical continuation of the clearance activity, position by position, bunker by bunker, long after there was any tactical reason to do so. Some describe men sitting down in the rubble. Some describe the beginning of the administrative process, counting, recording, reporting the numbers that would travel up the command chain and eventually become the statistics in the after-action report. Nobody describes it as simple. It fascinates me when I read the post-battle accounts how consistently the writers, both the official ones and the personal ones, reach for technical description when they're trying to convey what the island looked and felt like after the firing stopped. Shoup's message to the flagship noted positions cleared and beachhead dimensions. The after-action report cataloged equipment losses and unit dispositions. Even the personal letters and diary entries tend, in the immediate aftermath, toward the specific and the observable rather than the reflective. This is not evasion. It is, I think, the specific way that the human mind processes an experience that exceeds its available frameworks. You describe what you can see and measure because the alternative, attempting to name what you feel about what you've seen, requires a vocabulary that hasn't been assembled yet. The vocabulary gets assembled later, in the years after, in the letters home, in the memoir chapters, in the oral history sessions. In the immediate hours after Betio's securing, the record shows men doing what the previous 76 hours had trained them to do: counting things, noting things, producing the documentation of an institutional event from the raw material of a human one. The 23rd of November, 1943, 1,300 hours approximately, when the official declaration of secured reaches the command structure. On the water offshore, the transport ships that have been waiting since D-Day are beginning the process of approach, and the sailors on them can see the smoke and smell the air and know, from the silence of the guns, that the island has been taken. The Betio airfield, the strategic objective that the planning documents had identified as the reason for all of it, is a field of bomb craters and wreckage that will need weeks of engineering work before an aircraft can land on it. The 8-foot concrete bunker in the island center is intact. The LVT hulks are in the water and on the beach. The reef is still at 3 feet. The dead, American and Japanese and Korean, are where the battle left them, and the administrative process of accounting for them, of recording and counting and eventually burying them, is beginning with the particular efficiency of an institution that has been doing this work for a very long time and has procedures for it. The procedures don't quite account for the scale of what Betio produced. The procedures will be revised. For now, there are the numbers, and the silence, and the island that was built to be unsinkable sitting in the Pacific sun, conquered, smoking, and utterly still. Chapter 13. The After-Action Report as Primary Source. Reading the document that changed the war. Sometime in December of 1943, in the administrative spaces of the 2nd Marine Division's headquarters, probably aboard a ship, possibly on shore at a staging area, certainly somewhere that smelled of paper and cigarette smoke, and the particular institutional staleness of a staff working under deadline pressure, a group of officers sat down to produce the document that would, more than any single tactical decision or strategic directive, determine what the rest of the Pacific War looked like. The 2nd Marine Division After-Action Report for Operation Galvanic is not a dramatic document. It doesn't read like a battle narrative or a memorial. It reads like what it is: a military administrative record, organized by subject headings, written in the passive voice, calibrated for the specific audience of senior officers and planners who would decide what to do with its contents. Its prose is controlled. Its recommendations are specific. And underneath the controlled prose and the specific recommendations, if you read it the way it deserves to be read, as an institutional argument rather than a historical record, you find something genuinely extraordinary. A document written by survivors, within weeks of the event that nearly killed them, telling the institution that owned them exactly what it had gotten wrong and exactly what it needed to change. That is not a common document in any bureaucratic tradition. It is rarer still when the institution in question accepts the argument and acts on it within 2 months. The after-action report is accessible in digitized form through the Hyperwar archive maintained by iBiblio, and I want to recommend that anyone seriously interested in the Pacific War read it. Not for the narrative content, which is spare, but for the analytical content, which is dense and specific in ways that narrative history rarely captures. The document opens with the standard administrative header: unit designation, date, operation reference. Nothing in those first lines signals what follows. By page 3, the report is doing something that the genre of military after-action reports doesn't usually do. It is assigning causes, not just documenting effects. It is arguing. Most after-action reports describe what happened, with some assessment of why. This one describes what happened, assigns causes with a precision that names specific equipment failures and specific command architecture problems, and then prescribes solutions with the directness of people who understand that the solutions are a matter of life and death in the next operation, and the next operation is approximately 8 weeks away. The urgency is in the specificity. The urgency is in the timeline. The report wasn't written for history. It was written for Kwajalein. The LVT section of the report is the place I would start any serious reading of the document, because it is the most direct line from Betio's specific failures to the specific vehicles that the Marine Corps subsequently developed and fielded. The report doesn't simply note that LVTs were lost or that their armor was inadequate. It itemizes. It categorizes. It separates losses by cause, enemy fire versus hull damage versus mechanical failure, in a way that provides the engineering data needed to prioritize subsequent development work. And then it recommends, in specific and unambiguous terms, armored variants with factory-installed steel plate rather than field-improvised boilerplate, a ramp-equipped variant to allow troops to exit at the front rather than climbing over the sides under fire, an armored gun variant capable of providing fire support during the final approach phase that the naval gunfire restrictions had left uncovered. Each recommendation corresponds to a specific loss category in the preceding data. The report is doing what good engineering analysis does, working from observed failure modes to specific design changes. The LVT-4 with its rear ramp, the LVTA-1 with its gun turret, the fully armored LVTA-4 with its 75mm howitzer. All of these came from specific lines in the 2nd Marine Division AAR. The vehicles that fought at Iwo Jima were shaped by what the report said about Betio. The communications section is, by the standards of military administrative prose, a controlled denunciation, and reading it requires a slight adjustment of register to hear what it's actually saying. It doesn't say the TBY radio was dangerously inadequate for amphibious operations, though that is what it means. It says that the landing team suffered 100% failures in the TBY radios due to the fact that these sets are not waterproof, and that this outcome was consistent across multiple landing teams, and that it occurred in conditions that any future amphibious operation would replicate. It doesn't say that the flagship battleship USS Maryland was an inappropriate command platform for a Corps-level amphibious assault whose opening salvos would destroy its own communications. It recommends the development and employment of dedicated command ships, vessels whose primary function is command and control rather than combat, for future operations. It doesn't say Admiral Hill's ceasefire decision was wrong. It recommends revised procedures for fire support timing that would prevent the command authority conflict that produced the 30-minute gap. Every recommendation is specific. Every recommendation maps to a documented failure. Every recommendation is diplomatically phrased and operationally unambiguous. The document is simultaneously careful and devastating. and the care is tactical. It was reviewed by the chain of command before submission, and recommendations phrased as personal criticisms of flag officers would have been removed before publication. The recommendations phrased as procedural improvements survived. The tank infantry section formalized, in approximately 300 words of military technical prose, what the surviving engineers and infantry officers had worked out during the D-Day night in conversations on a beach. The sequence is described with the specificity of a procedure rather than a principle. The relative positioning of tank and engineer team, the role of suppressing infantry and covering the engineer approach, the timing of charge placement relative to the tank's covering fire, the requirement for simultaneous engagement of adjacent positions to prevent flanking fire during the assault. 300 words. The distillation of 72 hours of combat experience, multiple deaths, and overnight tactical analysis by men who had watched the informal discovery of a method save lives on D+1. This section of the AAR was read at Kwajalein by the officers planning that assault. It was read at Saipan. It was read at Peleliu and at Iwo Jima and at Okinawa. The 300 words are embedded, through their operational descendants, in every subsequent Pacific amphibious assault that involved concrete fortifications and Sherman tanks. There are a lot of those assaults. When I was cross-referencing the AAR's recommendations against the operational record of the Marshall Islands campaign, which followed Tarawa by approximately 6 to 8 weeks, the number that struck me most forcefully was the casualty rate comparison. Per comparable tactical objective, the Marshall Islands operation at Kwajalein produced casualty rates approximately 50% lower than Betio. The pre-assault bombardment at Kwajalein was extended from 3 hours to 3 days. The tank infantry procedures were rehearsed before the assault, rather than discovered during it. Dedicated command ships replaced battleships as flagships. Waterproof radio systems replaced the TBY for critical command nets. The improvement is not coincidental. It is direct. The specific failures documented in the AAR produced specific changes, and the specific changes produced a measurable reduction in the cost of the next operation. The 6 to 8 weeks between Tarawa and Kwajalein is, from the perspective of institutional learning, an extraordinarily compressed timeline. Most large bureaucratic institutions take years to translate after-action analysis into operational change. The Marine Corps in late 1943 did it in weeks, because the next operation was in weeks, and the people writing the AAR knew it. The section of the report that deals with command and control is the one I find most revealing in its omissions. And I want to be precise about this because the omissions are themselves a primary source. The AAR documents the communications failures comprehensively. It documents the LVT losses. It documents the equipment failures across every category. What it does not document, with any comparable directness, is the command decisions, the ceasefire call, the reserve commitment timing, the command architecture that placed fire support authority with the naval commander. These decisions appear in the report primarily in the form of procedural recommendations, changes to fire support timing authority, changes to command ship assignment, changes to communications protocols. The failures that the recommendations imply are readable in the recommendations themselves, if you're willing to do that backward inferential work. The document was reviewed by Admiral Hill and by V. Amphibious Corps before submission. What the chain of command would permit to be said directly about specific flag officer decisions, and what it would permit only to be implied through procedural recommendations, is itself evidence about the institutional politics of post-battle accountability. The report tells you what it can say. The gaps tell you what it couldn't. The speed of the AAR's dissemination through the planning chain for the Marshall Islands operation is, I think, the detail that most precisely demonstrates the institutional seriousness with which it was treated. Formally, the document was submitted to higher headquarters in December of 1943, approximately 3 to 4 weeks after the battle. Informally, its major findings have been communicated through personal contact and telephone between the 2nd Marine Division staff and Headquarters Marine Corps before the formal submission, because the Marshall Islands timeline was not going to wait for the bureaucratic cycle of formal report submission and review. The people who needed to know what the report said needed to know it immediately, and the informal communication system of a professional military, officers calling officers, staff sections briefing staff sections, was faster than the formal document cycle. By the time the formal AAR arrived at HQMC, much of its content had already been incorporated into the planning adjustments for the next operation. The document mattered. It was used. Its use began before it was officially submitted, because the situation required it. The recommendation for dedicated command ships, the specific proposal that the flagship for a major amphibious operation should be a vessel designed for command rather than combat, produced, within the subsequent year, the Amphibious Command Ship class, specifically USS Appalachian, the first vessel in a class built entirely around the command and communications functions that the Maryland had performed so poorly when its own salvos damaged its internal comms. The Appalachian had redundant communication systems, a purpose-built intelligence center, and none of the main battery armament that had made the Maryland's opening salvo into its own communications catastrophe. The ship exists because the AAR said it was needed. The class of ships that descended from the Appalachian, in evolved and modernized form, is still serving in the United States Navy in 2026. The echo of the Maryland's communications failure on the morning of the 20th of November, 1943, is in the design genealogy of every subsequent American amphibious command vessel. Betio is in that design. Betio is in a lot of things that don't announce their origins. The Kwajalein operation proceeded in January and February of 1944. The casualty rates were 50% lower per comparable objective. The post-battle assessments noted the improvements: the longer bombardment, the command ship, the armor, the communications. The institutional acknowledgement of what had been changed and why was fairly direct in the planning documents. The Tarawa lessons were cited by name, the specific changes traced to the specific AAR recommendations. That directness is unusual. Military institutions are generally more inclined to present improvements as routine evolution than as corrections of specific failures. The directness in the Marshall Islands planning record suggests that the people involved in both operations, some of the same officers, understood that the acknowledgement of failure was itself a form of respect for the cost that failure had produced. They weren't pretending Betio hadn't happened. They were building on what Betio had cost. The after-action report is the mechanism of that building, and its importance to the Pacific War is not metaphorical. It is operational, specific, and measurable in the 50%. Chapter 14. The Debate That Never Ended. Was Tarawa necessary? November of 1953, exactly 10 years after the battle, the United States Naval Institute's Proceedings magazine published an article simply titled Tarawa. Not the Battle of Tarawa, or Lessons from Tarawa, or any of the framing constructions that historical retrospectives typically employ. Just the name. And within that article, in the controlled prose of a naval officer writing for a professional audience, this sentence appeared. After the war, it has been said that Tarawa was an unnecessary battle, that the atoll could have as well been bypassed. The article doesn't say the claim is wrong, it says the claim has been made. 10 years after the battle, in the official journal of the service that ordered it, a professional military writer is acknowledging, in print, that the necessity of the operation that cost more than 1,000 American lives in 3 days has not settled into consensus. The argument is still going. The dead are still dead. And the institution that sent them there is still, a decade later, working out whether the sending was required. The strategic argument for Tarawa had a clean, geometrically satisfying logic that Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations and the primary advocate for the Central Pacific axis of the Pacific Campaign, could articulate with confidence. The Gilbert Islands were needed as a base for the Marshall Islands operation. The Marshall Islands were needed for the Mariana Islands campaign. The Marianas were where the B-29 bases that could range the Japanese home islands would be built. Tarawa was step one of a sequence, and if step one was not taken, the sequence could not proceed at the pace that King's strategic planning required. The Betio airfield specifically was identified as a potential threat to the Marshall Islands operation. Left in Japanese hands, the aircraft it could base might contest American air superiority over the Marshalls during the assault phase. The strategic chain was coherent. Its logic was, given the premises, defensible. The question was whether the premises were right, and whether defensible was the same as necessary. The bypass argument, the proposition that Betio's airfield could have been neutralized by carrier air power and the island simply isolated, its garrison left without resupply or reinforcement to reduce itself over time, was made before the battle by Army Air Forces officers and after it by a wider range of critics, and it has never been definitively refuted from the available planning documents. The bypass precedent existed. At Rabaul, which held a Japanese garrison of approximately 100,000 men, Allied commanders had chosen encirclement and isolation over direct assault, and the Rabaul garrison spent the rest of the war increasingly irrelevant as Allied operations moved past it. If Rabaul's 100,000 could be bypassed, why couldn't Betio's 5,000? The counter-argument focused on carrier aviation capability. In November of 1943, the argument went, the American carrier force was not yet large enough or reliable enough to sustain the air superiority screen required to prevent Japanese resupply of Betio, while simultaneously supporting a major assault on the Marshalls. The bypass would have required maintaining a continuous blockade of a Japanese-held airfield, while conducting a major amphibious operation within its potential strike range. That was a demand the carrier force of late 1943 could not safely meet. The institutional politics embedded in the bypass debate are the part that the strictly operational analysis tends to underemphasize, and I want to name them directly because they're real and they matter. Admiral King was not a neutral operational analyst when it came to the question of whether the Central Pacific axis of advance, the Navy-Marine axis through the islands, was necessary. He was the primary institutional advocate for that axis over Douglas MacArthur's South Pacific axis, which ran through New Guinea and the Philippines under Army command. The Central Pacific axis was, in a very specific institutional sense, the Navy's war. It was the direction of advance that gave the Navy and Marines the primary operational role in defeating Japan, rather than a supporting role to Army forces under MacArthur. The strategic argument for Tarawa was, simultaneously, an argument for the Navy's institutional primacy in the Pacific campaign. Those two things, operational necessity and institutional interest, pointed in the same direction. And when two things that powerful point in the same direction, it is genuinely difficult to determine how much weight each is actually carrying. Samuel Eliot Morison, the official naval historian whose multi-volume history of American naval operations in World War II remains the standard reference for much of the period, defended Tarawa's necessity in terms that are operationally coherent and institutionally convenient simultaneously. His argument rests heavily on the carrier aviation capability assessment. The American carrier force in late 1943 couldn't reliably sustain a bypass interdiction while also supporting the Marshalls' assault. The argument is probably correct. It's also an argument that Morison, writing under Navy auspices with access shaped by institutional relationships, had institutional reasons to find persuasive. I'm not accusing Morison of dishonesty. I think he believed what he wrote. I'm noting that the "was Tarawa necessary" question is one where the best-positioned historians have not been disinterested, and that this matters for how we evaluate their conclusions. The post-war critiques of Tarawa's necessity came from several directions, and they're worth distinguishing because they make different arguments. The Army Air Force's critique, made most vocally by officers like General Hap Arnold, rested on the claim that carrier aviation could have handled the bypass interdiction, that the Army's air power was being underutilized in the Navy's island-hopping strategy, and that the casualty costs of direct assault on every fortified island were unsustainable across the length of the Pacific. This critique had institutional as well as operational dimensions. The historical analysis of scholars like Ronald Spector, in his study of the Pacific War, took a somewhat different approach. questioning whether the pace of the Central Pacific advance was driven by operational necessity or by the institutional competition between King and MacArthur for resources and prestige, and whether a slower advance that bypassed more heavily fortified positions would have achieved equivalent strategic results at lower cost. Spector's question can't be answered from the available record because it requires a counterfactual. What would have happened if Tarawa hadn't been assaulted? And the historical record doesn't contain the counterfactual. What it contains is what happened. 1,026 American dead in 3 days. Betio's airfield operational for American use within 72 hours of the island's capture. A doctrinal revolution that reduced subsequent casualties significantly. The bypass alternative exists only as a possibility that was foreclosed in November of 1943. The Betio airfield was operational for American use within 72 hours of the battle's end, the 26th of November, 1943. The first American aircraft landing on the repaired and partially cleared strip. It subsequently served as a base for operations supporting the Marshall Islands campaign. Whether its role was operationally essential or operationally convenient, whether the Marshall Islands assault would have proceeded on schedule without it, or would have been delayed, or would have succeeded anyway with somewhat greater difficulty, is a question that the available planning documents don't resolve cleanly. Convenient and necessary are not always distinguishable from inside an ongoing campaign, because the campaign is designed around the assets available and the operations are planned to use those assets. The absence of an asset changes the plan, but the changed plan might achieve the same result. Or it might not. The counterfactual is genuinely inaccessible. What I find most honest to say about the necessity debate, having spent considerable time with it, is that it is unresolvable from the available evidence, and that its persistence, the fact that it was still being argued in the proceedings a decade after the battle, and is still being argued in Pacific War scholarship in the present, reflects something real about the nature of the question. It is not a question with a hidden answer that better research will eventually uncover. It is a question about the relationship between strategic logic and human cost that doesn't have a clean resolution, because strategic logic and human cost are incommensurable. You can demonstrate that Tarawa's capture served the strategic sequence. You cannot demonstrate that the strategic sequence couldn't have been achieved some other way, at lower cost, over a longer timeline. The choice between those options, speed versus cost, King's timeline versus an alternative one, was a choice made by specific people with specific institutional interests in specific circumstances in November of 1943. The choice cannot be unmade. The cost was real. Whether necessary is the right word for that cost is a judgment each person reading the record has to make for themselves. And I'm deeply suspicious of anyone who makes it with confidence in either direction. The official Marine Corps position on Tarawa's necessity has been, since the immediate post-war period, essentially affirmative. The battle was required. The lessons learned saved lives in subsequent operations, and the cost was operationally justified. This position is institutionally logical, as I noted in the outline stage of this project, because the Marine Corps cannot formally argue that its bloodiest Pacific assault was an error. But the internal professional discourse, the Gazette articles, the proceedings analyses, the War College papers, has been less settled than the official position suggests. Some of the most searching post-war analyses of Tarawa's operational planning failures were written by Marine officers, published in Marine professional journals, in the years immediately after the war. The institution's public narrative and its professional self-examination have not always been identical, and the gap between them is itself evidence of the seriousness with which the Marine Corps took the question. They knew it wasn't simple. They said so, internally, repeatedly. The official answer and the professional argument are both real, and they're pointing in different directions, and that tension has never been fully resolved. The 23rd of November, 1943. The battle is over. The island is secured. The strategic sequence continues. The Marshalls, the Marianas, the home islands. Somewhere in the Central Pacific, the machinery of the campaign grinds forward at the pace that King's planning required, using the doctrine that Betio's survivors had developed and codified in 3 days and 3 weeks. And on Betio itself, in the coral and the sand and the rubble of the positions that the campaign required to be cleared, the dead are where the battle left them. Whether it had to be exactly this way, at exactly this cost, at exactly this time, that question is still going. The Proceedings article from 10 years later, with its careful acknowledgement that it has been said, that careful institutional non-commitment to a verdict is the most honest single sentence I've found about where the argument stands. It has been said. The saying hasn't stopped. The island doesn't answer. Chapter 15. The Body Count No One Counted. Korean Laborers and the Invisible Dead. Sometime in the first half of 1943, on a coral island in the Central Pacific, a man mixed concrete. He was Korean. He had been conscripted under Japan's National Mobilization Law, a legal framework that was formally voluntary in its initial provisions and had become, by 1942, operationally indistinguishable from forced labor for the men it captured. He had been transported to Betio as part of the 111th Pioneer Unit, one of approximately 1,247 men brought from Korea to this island to build the fortifications that would defend it. He mixed the concrete with salt water. The island had no adequate fresh water supply for the volume of construction, and he placed it in forms built from salvaged lumber and coconut logs, and the concrete cured in the Pacific sun and became the walls of the bunkers and the pillboxes and the command post that would, in November of the same year, be fought over at enormous human cost by people from 2 other countries, neither of which was his. He probably didn't know all of that at the time. He knew he was building something large and that he was doing it far from home, under compulsion, in a place he hadn't chosen to be. He mixed the concrete. The walls are still standing. His name is not in any record that has been located and translated into the accessible historical literature. The 111th Pioneer Unit is one of the least documented significant groups in the entire Battle of Tarawa record, and the inadequacy of the documentation is not accidental. The Japanese military labor mobilization system that produced the Pioneer Unit didn't generate records designed to track individual Korean workers as individual people. It generated administrative records designed to account for labor units as operational assets, which is a different thing entirely. The men of the Pioneer Unit appear in the Japanese administrative record as a labor complement, not as individuals. They appear in the American record, the post-battle surveys, the prisoner interrogation summaries, as a category. Korean laborers, distinguished from Japanese military personnel, primarily because their interrogation produced different and useful intelligence about the construction of the fortifications. 129 of them were alive when the battle ended. The interrogations of those 129 men are not, to my knowledge, available in comprehensive translated form in the English language literature. Their specific testimony, what they saw, what they experienced, how they survived, is among the most important primary sources we don't have complete access to. The construction program that the Pioneer Unit and the Japanese garrison executed over 9 months required, by the post-battle engineering estimates, approximately 4,500 tons of concrete placed in permanent structures, supplemented by an estimated 17,000 cubic yards of coral fill packed into position, and log and sand defensive works along every accessible approach. Each cubic yard of cured concrete weighs approximately 2 tons. The Pioneer Unit, supplemented by the garrison's construction details but providing the primary labor force, mixed, transported, and placed this material largely by hand. Betio had no mechanized construction equipment beyond basic tools and manually operated machinery. The fortification that took the Marine Corps 3 hours of the heaviest pre-assault naval bombardment in Pacific War history to reduce by 17% was built by human physical labor on an island with no adequate fresh water under military authority that the men performing the labor had no capacity to resist or leave. The walls that stopped bullets were built by their hands. That is not a metaphor. It is a material fact with specific human dimensions that the standard histories of the battle consistently fail to acknowledge with adequate weight. The casualty accounting for Betio, which appears in both the American after-action reports and in subsequent historical literature, categorizes the Korean dead under the Japanese casualty figures. This was operationally logical. The Pioneer Unit was under Japanese military authority, occupied no formal non-combatant designation in the operational records of either side, and was present on the island when the battle began. The administrative decision to count them as Japanese casualties was made without particular malice. It reflected the bureaucratic categories available in the accounting systems of both the Japanese military and the American forces that subsequently surveyed the island. Its consequence is that the historical literature cannot accurately distinguish between Japanese military personnel, who were combatants by any reasonable definition, fighting from prepared positions with assigned weapons, and Korean civilian laborers who had been transported to the island against their will and had no role in its defense. When scholars cite the Japanese casualties at Tarawa, they are citing a figure that includes between 1,000 and 1,100 Korean non-combatants who died in a battle they had no stake in, fighting for neither side, built into the island's defensive architecture in the most literal possible sense. The specific experience of the Korean laborers during the battle is almost entirely absent from the surviving primary source record, and I want to be honest about what this absence means for what can responsibly be said. I can establish from the structural evidence, the deployment records, the post-battle survivor count, the general account of conditions on Betio during the assault, that they were there, that they were not combatants, that they had no designated shelter during the fighting, and that approximately 90% of them died. I cannot establish, from the available translated and accessible sources, the specific details of individual experience, which positions they sheltered in, how they attempted to signal non-combatant status, what their interactions with the Japanese garrison looked like as the battle compressed and the garrison turned its full attention to the fighting. The fragmentary prisoner interrogation summaries indicate that some Korean laborers attempted to surrender during the fighting and were, in some cases, killed by American fire before the nature of their non-combatant status could be communicated. But the summaries are exactly that, summaries, filtered through translation, organized around the information the American interrogators were seeking rather than the testimony the survivors needed to give. The full oral record of what the 111th Pioneer Unit experienced at Betio, if it was ever systematically gathered, has not entered the accessible historical literature in a form that this project can responsibly draw upon. The legal status of the Korean laborers at Betio is, with the benefit of subsequent international humanitarian law development, relatively clear in its broad outline. The National Mobilization Law and its implementing ordinances, under which the Pioneer Unit was recruited and deployed, operated in practice as a system of forced labor, particularly after 1942, when voluntary participation had largely been replaced by administrative compulsion and economic coercion. The men transported to Betio were under Japanese military authority, in a combat theater, unable to leave their assigned location, working under conditions determined by that authority rather than by any form of consent. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo Trials, and subsequent development of international humanitarian law established legal categories that would cover the Pioneer Unit's status with reasonable clarity: civilian forced laborers in a military context, with the protections that status theoretically entails, and the practical reality that those protections were entirely unavailable in the specific circumstances of a Pacific island under military governance in 1943. There is no memorial on Betio dedicated to the Korean laborers of the 111th Pioneer Unit. They are not commemorated by the Republic of Kiribati memorial infrastructure, which focuses on the military engagement. They are not formally recognized in the Republic of Korea's official war commemoration system, which is oriented primarily toward the Korean War. They are not listed in Japanese military records because they were not military personnel. They are not individually named in American post-battle records because the American administrative system didn't track their names. They exist in the institutional record of every country with a potential claim to their memory as a category in a footnote, if they appear at all. The concrete they mixed is in the walls of buildings that are still standing. The walls are better documented than the men who built them. That asymmetry between the preservation of the material and the erasure of the human is not unique to Tarawa. It is a consistent feature of how forced labor is treated in the archival record of military history. It is more visible at Betio than in most cases because the concrete is so obviously specific still there. It strikes me that the standard Tarawa narrative, even the careful, critical ones, tends to begin its moral accounting with the American dead and the Japanese dead, and to treat the Korean dead as a datum at the end, including construction laborers. The phrase appears in parentheses in most casualty tables. Parentheses are typographical subordination. They indicate that what is enclosed is supplementary, contextual, lesser in some definitional sense than what appears outside them. Approximately 1,118 Korean men who mixed concrete for 8 months and then died in a battle between two foreign powers. In parentheses, I'm not claiming that the American or Japanese losses were less important than the Korean losses. I'm saying that the parentheses represent a choice about how to organize historical importance, and that the choice reflects something about whose deaths get full accounting and whose get supplementary notation, and that this pattern is not accidental and is not confined to Tarawa. The archaeological work that History Flight and associated organizations have conducted on Betio in recent years has encountered the Korean casualty problem in a specifically practical form. Skeletal remains recovered from mass burial sites cannot always be identified as American, Japanese, or Korean on the basis of physical characteristics alone, and the absence of individual identification documents for the Korean laborers means that DNA comparison, the primary tool for identifying American remains, has limited utility for the Korean dead, unless family reference samples exist and can be matched against a database that was never built for this population. The forensic problem of identifying Korean dead at Betio is, at present, essentially unsolved. The remains exist in the coral. The identification pathway is structurally inadequate for the specific population. The consequence is that the men of the 111th Pioneer Unit who are recovered from Betio's burial sites are most likely to be cataloged, if at all, as non-American remains, a category that encompasses both Japanese military personnel and Korean civilian laborers without distinguishing them, and then processed through a system that was designed to identify Americans and is not equipped to do more than that for anyone else. The parentheses in the casualty table have a forensic continuation that is still active on Betio today. Chapter 16. The Missing of Betio, History Flight, and the MIA Problem. The 23rd of November, 1943. The battle is over. The island is secured. The administrative process of accounting for the dead has begun, and it has begun in the specific conditions of a 1943 Pacific atoll, a narrow strip of coral, 291 acres total, covered in the wreckage of 3 days of intense fighting, with no established infrastructure for mass casualty processing, with working parties operating under the tropical sun, with the urgency of an ongoing campaign that required the assault force to move on. The graves registration units did what they could. They buried men where they had fallen when no better option was available. They marked positions with whatever markers could be made from available materials. They recorded what they could record in the chaos of a just-concluded battle, with no administrative support and an inadequate understanding of where every casualty had occurred. The records they produced were incomplete. Graves were missed. Positions shifted. The coral that was packed over temporary graves was, in some cases, later disturbed by the construction and development that followed the battle. The men who were buried, carefully and with appropriate military ceremony when possible, in November of 1943, were not all still where they had been buried when the post-war recovery teams arrived. Some had been there all along. They are there now. Approximately 374 of them, by the most current Defense POW/MIA accounting agency estimates, are still on Betio, waiting. The DPAA, the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency, the United States government body responsible for the recovery and identification of American service members listed as missing in action from all conflicts, maintains an active project for Tarawa that is, as of current records, one of the largest single-site MIA accounting projects in the World War II Pacific Theater. The numbers are specific and worth stating precisely. Approximately 374 Americans remain unaccounted for from the Battle of Tarawa. Approximately 160 sets of remains have been recovered and identified to date, a running total that has been incrementally increasing through the ongoing work of History Flight and related organizations. Approximately 250 additional sets of remains are estimated by History Flight to be recoverable with adequate excavation resources, based on ground-penetrating radar surveys and archival analysis of the original burial records. These are not speculative projections. They are evidence-based operational estimates from practitioners who have spent more than a decade with survey equipment in Betio's coral substrate, and they are specific enough to be credible. The remains are there. The question of whether they will be recovered before Betio's continuing urban development makes them permanently inaccessible is not historical. It is present tense and urgent. History Flight is a private nonprofit organization founded by Mark Noah, an aviation historian and pilot who began investigating the Tarawa MIA problem in the mid-2000s after discovering the scale of the unresolved accounting. The organization's methodology combines three distinct investigative strands in a way that is genuinely innovative in the field of historical remains recovery. First, archival analysis. Systematic examination of the original November 1943 graves registration records, cross-referenced with aerial photographs taken from American aircraft during and immediately after the battle, to produce predicted locations for burial sites that the post-war recovery efforts missed. Second, ground-penetrating radar survey. Systematic GPR scanning of the predicted locations, identifying subsurface density contrasts that indicate buried organic material in disturbed soil, the physical signature of a burial site. Third, archaeological excavation. Careful, documented excavation of identified sites with forensic recovery procedures designed to preserve maximum biological material for subsequent DNA analysis. The combination of these three methods, refined over more than a decade of operational work on Betio, has produced the results that the DPAA's standard recovery approach, which is reactive rather than systematic, responding to reported discoveries rather than proactively identifying sites, had not achieved in 60 years of working the Tarawa case. The ground-penetrating radar technology that History Flight uses on Betio requires some explanation, because the specific characteristics of the coral substrate make Tarawa a more technically demanding GPR environment than most terrestrial sites. GPR works by transmitting pulses of electromagnetic energy into the ground and measuring the time required for those pulses to reflect off subsurface density boundaries and return to a surface receiver. In standard soil, the contrast between a burial pit, with its disturbed fill, decomposing organic material, and coffin or wrapping remnants, and the surrounding undisturbed earth produces a clear, interpretable signal. In Betio's coral substrate, which is highly reflective and contains natural void spaces that produce GPR signatures similar to burial pits, distinguishing genuine burial sites from geological noise requires an experienced operator and extensive signal post-processing using interpretive protocols that History Flight has developed specifically for this environment. There is no manual for GPR survey in Pacific coral atoll substrates. History Flight wrote the practice by doing it, iteratively, over more than a decade, adjusting their interpretive methods each time an excavation confirmed or contradicted a predicted site. This is how specialist knowledge works, not from a textbook, but from accumulated practice on a specific type of ground. The 2015 recovery of Cemetery 27 was the result of exactly this methodology, and it represents the single largest Tarawa MIA recovery in the documented history of the accounting effort. History Flight's archival analysis had identified a probable mass burial site in a section of Betio that had been developed, built over, paved, incorporated into the island's post-war urban infrastructure in the decades following the battle. The development made the site inaccessible by standard archaeological methods and meant that the post-war recovery teams had never surveyed it. Ground-penetrating radar identified subsurface signatures consistent with a large burial pit beneath the developed surface. Excavation, which required coordination with Kiribati authorities and careful archaeological procedure to preserve the maximum recoverable evidence, produced the remains of 35 individuals. DNA analysis at the DPAA's laboratory subsequently identified individual Marines whose families had been informed since November of 1943 only that their relative was missing in action. The gap between that notification and the identification confirmation was, for some families, more than 70 years. The official notification of recovery arrived, for the families of identified Marines, in the form of a letter from a government agency. Some of the people who received those letters were grandchildren of the men identified. They had never known their grandfather except as a name on a missing persons record and a photograph. The 2019 recovery yielded approximately 30 additional service members from a burial site discovered beneath a road on Betio. Among the remains subsequently identified was at least one Medal of Honor recipient from the battle, an identification that was confirmed by DNA comparison and officially announced in the years following the recovery. The identification of a Medal of Honor recipient from a mass grave on a Pacific island more than 75 years after his death is, in its specific details, one of the more precise measurements of the gap between institutional honor and institutional accountability that the Tarawa record contains. The man received the nation's highest military decoration. His name is on a citation, in a frame, in a display case somewhere. He was, simultaneously, lying in an unmarked mass grave on an atoll in the Central Pacific. The medal and the grave coexisted for more than 7 decades. The forensic process that eventually connected them, DNA extracted from a recovered bone, matched against a reference sample submitted by a family member who may never have met the man they were helping to identify, took 2 to 4 years from recovery to official announcement. The institutional machinery for honoring the dead worked faster than the institutional machinery for finding them. The gap between those two speeds is measurable in decades. The DPAA's Tarawa project faces logistical and institutional constraints that are worth being specific about, because the "why aren't they all identified yet" question is sometimes posed in a way that implies institutional neglect, when the reality is more complicated. The DPAA manages active MIA accounting cases for approximately 72,000 Americans from World War II alone, across multiple theaters and multiple Pacific islands, with a finite annual budget and a finite number of specialist forensic teams. Tarawa competes for those resources against Guadalcanal, against the Philippines, against Europe, against Korea and Vietnam, and more recent conflicts. The diplomatic access to Betio requires negotiation with the Republic of Kiribati, an independent nation with its own priorities and its own relationship to the battle site. And the terms of that access have not always permitted the pace of recovery that History Flight's operational estimates suggest is achievable. The technical capability to find and identify the remaining remains exists. The institutional and diplomatic machinery required to deploy that capability at the pace the timeline demands is the constraint. History Flight's Mark Noah, in his congressional testimony of November of 2019, estimated approximately 250 additional recoverable sets of remains on Betio. He said this to a congressional subcommittee with jurisdiction over the DPAA. The estimate was noted. The timeline for acting on it has been shaped by factors that forensic capability alone cannot resolve. Betio today is the commercial and port hub of the Republic of Kiribati, with a population of approximately 15,000 people living on the same 291 acres where the battle was fought. The Japanese command bunker still stands, its 8-foot concrete walls essentially unchanged, partially visible between buildings in what is now a dense residential and commercial neighborhood. LVT hulks corrode in the lagoon. A modest memorial marks the landing beaches. The island that Shibazaki built as a killing architecture, that the Marines assaulted for 76 hours at a cost of approximately 6,400 lives, is a place where people live ordinary lives in the physical presence of extraordinary history. They walk past the bunker. Their children play near it. New buildings go up, and sometimes, when foundations are dug, when roads are extended, when the development that any growing population center requires reaches a new section of the island, bones come up from the coral. The island returns its dead slowly, contingently, in the intervals between construction projects and under the specific conditions that ground-penetrating radar and careful archaeological procedure can create when the resources and the access are both available at the same time. 374 Americans, still there by the most current accounting. 250 potentially recoverable by the methods that History Flight has demonstrated work on this specific substrate, in this specific environment, with this specific combination of archival analysis and survey technology and careful excavation. Each year that passes without systematic recovery is a year in which Betio's development moves forward, in which potential burial sites are built over or disturbed by construction, in which the window of accessible recovery narrows. This is not a historical problem with a historical timeline. It is an active situation with a closing window, and the window is not infinitely patient. The men of the 2nd Marine Division, who are still in Betio's coral, went there in November of 1943 and have not yet come home. Whether they will, and when, and how many of them, that question is being answered right now in congressional budget negotiations and diplomatic access agreements and the specific calendar of archaeological field seasons on an atoll in the Central Pacific. History Flight's radar keeps finding them. The institutional machinery for bringing them home moves at the speed of its own priorities. The two speeds are not the same speed, and the gap between them is still open. Chapter 17. What Tarawa Made. The Doctrine, the Dead, and the Living Question. The Tracked Vehicle Museum at Camp Del Mar, California, holds a specific artifact that I want to start with because I think it is the most compressed single object in the entire physical record of the Battle of Tarawa. LVT, one vehicle number 49, My Dolores, sits in the museum on a concrete floor, stabilized against deterioration, labeled with a placard that describes its historical significance as the first vehicle to reach Betio's shore on the 20th of November, 1943. The vehicle is painted. The boilerplate is still attached around the cab, 3/8 of an inch of industrial steel that wasn't enough to stop the fire that killed the men in the cab or shot the rifle in half that was resting on the vehicle's side. Visitors walk around it. They take photographs. The placard describes the vehicle's role in the assault. Private First Class Edward Moore, who drove it into the Seawall, whose rifle was shot in half before he could reach for it, who spent the rest of D-Day carrying ammunition to machine gun crews until he had to be evacuated. Moore is mentioned as the driver, a figure in the vehicle's story rather than a story in his own right. The vehicle is preserved. The man is a footnote. That asymmetry between the institution's capacity to preserve its machines and its capacity to preserve the full weight of the people who operated them is not unique to Tarawa, and it is not unique to the Marine Corps. It is how institutional memory works when it processes extraordinary events at scale. The machine is a single artifact that can be maintained and displayed. The man is a life with dimensions that a placard cannot hold. What Tarawa produced, in the most directly measurable sense, is the post-Betio Pacific Amphibious doctrine. The chain from the specific failures of D-Day to the specific improvements at Kwajalein, 6 to 8 weeks, 50% lower casualty rates per comparable objective, is one of the most precisely documented instances of rapid institutional learning in American military history, and it deserves to be understood in its full specificity rather than summarized as lessons were learned. The lessons were specific. The armored LVTA-1, with its 37mm gun turret and factory-installed armor plate, replaced the improvised boilerplate LVT-2 in the assault vehicle role. The LVT-4, with its rear ramp, eliminated the requirement to exit over the sides under fire. The dedicated amphibious command ship, descended directly from the AAR's recommendation, replaced the battleship flagship and its catastrophically vulnerable internal communications. Waterproof tactical radios replaced the TBY sets whose cork gasket seals had failed at Tarawa, with a consistency that the post-battle report described as, effectively, guaranteed. Each specific failure produced a specific fix. The fix was tested at Kwajalein. The test was measurably successful. This is not metaphorical improvement. It is documented, quantified, operationally real. The longer doctrinal chain, from Betio's boilerplate to the present, runs through 80 years of Marine Corps vehicle development with a continuity that is not always announced but is structurally present. The LVT program that the Tarawa AAR reshaped became, through successive generations of development, the Amphibious Assault Vehicle, the AAV-7, that served as the Marine Corps' primary waterborne assault vehicle from the 1970s through the early 2020s. The AAV-7's extended service life program kept the vehicle operational into the 21st century while the replacement program developed. That replacement, the Amphibious Combat Vehicle, the ACV-30, which the Marine Corps began fielding in the early 2020s, carries in its design genealogy the specific requirements that the Tarawa AAR identified in December of 1943: armored hull, rear ramp exit, adequate water propulsion, weapons integration for the final approach phase. The design lineage is not metaphorical. The ACV-30 is a direct institutional descendant of the boilerplate that Marine engineers bolted onto LVTs in Samoa in October of 1943. Betio is in its design. The 3/8-inch steel that wasn't enough is embedded, through 80 years of incremental improvement, in the vehicle that replaced the vehicle that replaced the thing that wasn't adequate. This is how institutions process experience that costs enough to demand change. Slowly, specifically, across timescales that outlast the people who paid the cost. David Shoup, who commanded the Betio beachhead from under the pier, wounded, with a radio that worked because a sergeant held his body over it, became Commandant of the Marine Corps in 1960, appointed by President Eisenhower. He served as Commandant through 1963, and then, in retirement, he wrote an article for a major American publication arguing that the United States had developed a dangerous institutional tendency toward military adventurism, that the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower had warned about in his farewell address was producing a policy orientation in which military solutions were reaching into domains that didn't require them, at costs that democratic governance should not be willing to pay. Shoup became, in his post-military life, a critic of the Vietnam War escalation, one of the more prominent military voices arguing against the logic that had produced, in his specific professional experience, the assault on Betio. I don't read this as contradiction. I read it as testimony. The man who held the line at Tarawa under conditions that most command structures would not have survived spent the remainder of his public life arguing, from that specific experience, that the instrument he had mastered was being deployed with insufficient regard for what its deployment cost. His post-military career is a primary source about Tarawa's weight in a way that no tactical document can be. The Medal of Honor recipient who became the commandant, who became the war critic, is the same person, and the continuity is not ironic. It is the argument of a specific life, organized around a specific experience, arriving at a specific conclusion. The Force Design 2030 debate within the contemporary Marine Corps is the place where Tarawa's operational legacy is most directly alive in 2026, and it's worth naming the connection precisely. The Force Design 2030 initiative, published in 2020 and updated through 2022, restructured the Marine Corps away from the large-scale amphibious assault capability that Tarawa validated and toward distributed littoral operations, more relevant to a Western Pacific strategic environment dominated by Chinese anti-access and area denial systems. The restructuring reduced the number of infantry battalions, eliminated all of the Corps' tanks, and reoriented towards smaller, more dispersed formations, optimized for stand-in operations in the first island chain. Critics of Force Design 2030, including retired general officers and military historians, argued that abandoning large-scale forcible entry capability was premature, and that the Tarawa to Incheon tradition of decisive amphibious assault remained operationally relevant. Advocates argued that the Taiwan Strait environment of 2026 bears no meaningful resemblance to the Tarawa Lagoon of 1943, and that preparing to refight Betio in an era of precision anti-ship missiles and satellite surveillance is precisely the kind of institutional backward-looking that produces catastrophic failure in the next conflict. Both arguments cite Tarawa. They are citing it to reach opposite conclusions. The battle that validated the doctrine is now being invoked by both sides of the argument about whether that doctrine is still applicable, which means that Tarawa is not simply historical. It is a living institutional reference point in a live professional debate about what the Marine Corps should be. The 374 unaccounted for Americans at Betio are the most direct measure of what Tarawa's unfinished obligation looks like in 2026. And I want to hold that number alongside the doctrinal legacy and the institutional debate without resolving the tension between them. The doctrine that Tarawa produced saved lives at Kwajalein. The LVT design lineage is in the ACV-30. The force design debate cites the battle by name. These are institutional continuities, the ways in which the battle lives in the structures and arguments and equipment of the present. The 374 are a different kind of continuity. Not an argument about doctrine or design, but 374 specific people who went to Betio in November of 1943 and are still there. History Flight's radar finds them in the coral when it has the access and the resources to look. The DPAA's identification laboratory can name them when it has the recovered material to analyze. The window for systematic recovery is narrowing as Betio's development continues. These things are all simultaneously true, and they exist in a relationship with each other that is uncomfortable if you hold them together. The institution that the battle built is thriving and arguing about its future, while the people who built it are in coral on a Pacific atoll waiting for a ground-penetrating radar that moves at the speed of congressional budget cycles. The Battle of Tarawa cost, in the currency that war denominates in, approximately 6,400 lives across 76 hours on an island of 291 acres. The arithmetic of that, roughly 22 deaths per acre, approximately 84 deaths per hour sustained across 3 days, is not a figure that conveys experience. It conveys scale, which is different. The experience was in the living room, measured in beach dimensions, and the sergeant whose name isn't in the record, and the boilerplate that wasn't quite armor, and the tide that sat at 3 feet, and the radio that worked because someone shielded it. The experience was in the concrete that the Korean laborers mixed with salt water, and the bunker walls that are still standing, and the 129 men who survived, and the 1,118 who didn't, and whose names aren't in accessible records. The experience was in Shoop, in the water under the pier, and Ryan on the beach organizing strangers, and Moore driving my Dolores into the wall. The institutional record captures the scale. The human record captures the experience. Neither is complete without the other. And the relationship between them, between the 6,400 and the specific weight of individual human lives that number contains, is the central problem of how to hold Tarawa in the mind at the necessary distance of 80-plus years. I've been thinking, in the final stages of organizing this project, about what the adequate ending for a Tarawa documentary looks like. The temptation is resolution. The doctrine was improved, the lessons were learned, the sacrifice meant something, history was changed. All of this is true. The other temptation is irresolution. The debate about necessity is unresolved. The MIAs are unaccounted for. The Korean laborers are in parentheses. The questions outnumber the answers. This is also true. What I keep arriving at is something that isn't resolution or irresolution, but something more like a demand for continued attention. The specific demand that the primary source record makes on anyone who spends serious time with it. The after-action report says what it says. The radio logs have their silences. The letters use their living rooms as measurements. The bunker walls are still standing. The radar is still finding people in the coral. The debate about necessity is still going in the professional journals. All of this is simultaneously historical and present tense, and the claim that Tarawa is history, in the sense of something concluded and settled, is one that the evidence consistently refuses. The island doesn't settle. It keeps producing evidence. It keeps requiring response. The 374 are still waiting. The argument about what they're being sent there ultimately served is still being made. In documents and budget negotiations and professional debates and the specific language of a force design initiative that invokes their battle while restructuring the institution they built with their deaths. The 20th of November, 1943, and everything that follows from it. The reef at 3 feet, the LVTs burning, the sergeant holding the radio, the living room as the measure of a killing ground. The bunker, with its 8-foot wall still standing between buildings on an island where people now live ordinary lives. All of that is still present in the coral and the concrete and the design specifications and the unresolved arguments and the names still missing from the record. The island was secured at approximately 1300 hours on the 23rd of November, 1943. It hasn't stopped producing history since. And somewhere on Betio today, under a road or beneath a building foundation, or in the coral flat that the tide still covers and uncovers at the rate that Holland predicted and the planning staff didn't quite believe, there is a Marine from the 2nd Division who has been there since that November, and who has not yet been found, and who has not yet been named. The ground-penetrating radar is looking. The window is open, for now. That is where this ends, not with a conclusion, but with that specific, ongoing, present tense fact: someone is still looking, the window is still open, and the island still has its dead.